So good morning, everyone. Welcome to Latino Culture and Communication, More Than Just Translation. My name is Diane Padilla. This 4-hour workshop is brought to you by the Northeast Caribbean ATTC. That's our Addiction Technology Transfer Center. So some of the logistics we'll get through now, so that way we can just stay focused on the content. So the certificate of completion. The ritual here is that at the end of the session, you'll complete an online evaluation. So I'll present a code that you can scan, but my colleague will also put the evaluation link inside the chat box. And I'll stop a few minutes ahead of time so we can do this and not stay past our committed time. And so we here today from 9:30 to 1:30 Eastern time. Certificates will be sent out within a week or so, and a copy of the slides. If for any reason you kind of just can't get the evaluation out of the way and we see that you haven't submitted one, so my colleague Tree, I'll introduce you to these very important folks. She will be able to send you the link again. So it's not often, but sometimes somebody has a tech problem with accessing the link. So this webinar is approved for 4 hours of KSAC, CPP, and CPS credentialing, and we always remind you about this. We need you to be visual the entire session. Participation is optional, but the visual piece is the critical piece that's going to help us justify sending you a certificate, because that's the only way we know for sure that we can confirm your attendance. So this is a team I'm lucky enough to be a part of. The young woman on the right, Patricia Chappell. If you don't know her, you will know her. She is the one who sends out all the materials, reminders, registration information for folks to sign up to our courses. And she's the one who's going to follow up with you and provide you with a copy of the slides and any handouts we use. And certainly she'll follow up with you around the evaluation. Mr. Clyde Frederick is kind of like my silent partner. So whenever I do a webinar here, he's behind the scenes doing all the administrative or the technical aspect of facilitating a webinar. And so he can respond under the name Northeast Caribbean in the drop-down list from the chat box. And he's really good with the tech stuff. So if you've got any kind of audio issue or any kind of tech issue, just send him a message directly. He can help you out with that. So again, my name is Diane Padilla. I'm a research project manager at the New York State Psychiatric Institute out of Columbia University Services, and I'm presenting this under one of our grants, which is the Northeast Caribbean ATTC. And one of the things that I do quite a bit is also I work with different organizations around a couple of different issues, equity and inclusion. A lot of my work is done around culture, trauma, stress, and substance use. And also I do a lot of work on screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment, or ESPERT, which is an evidence-based model in medical settings, but it's also very effective and a strength-based model for other settings. And so, and I do, just like you folks, you wear a lot of different hats, even though you have one title. We're the same with, like, in that sense with you folks. We all have our specific titles here, the team and I, and yet we do like 100 different things. So we're grateful to be here. So the acknowledgement, this just means that we have been funded, just to let you know that we prepared this under our NEC TTC grant. So SANSO funds 3 different disciplines: the Addiction Technology Transfer Center, Mental Health TTC, and the Prevention and Recovery TTC. And so, and I added the recovery because I always think I kind of associate the prevention with the recovery piece. And so, because a lot of our peer approved courses for continuing education come from both ATTC and PTTC. So that's something to consider. So really what SAMHSA is doing by funding us is just helping you folks to get your credentials and keep your credentials to get the hours that you need, so you keep those needed letters, so you keep doing the work you're doing. And so we get to be lucky enough to provide you the latest information, best practices on what's in the field. And we always try to keep it updated with current practices. Different practices do evolve and get even more refined. And so we bring that all the time to our different trainings. So here, language matters, words have power, people first. That's a quick brief, that's a quick reading of that. And so I'm gonna ask you folks, I'm gonna ask you folks if you don't mind. So when we present this slide and we talk about, words matter, people, we need to put people first. Can you raise your hand, someone, and kind of just explain to the group rather, what you understand that slide to me? And I'm going to bring this back up. Language matters, words have power, people first. Who would like to speak to that? Great, Ivy, thank you. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. So an example that I can share is the idea of using the term enslaved versus slave, or utilizing the terms human traffickers instead of plantation owners, or things like that. As far as why it matters, I think it's just being mindful that even if it seems small, just like the EN on top of enslaved instead of slave is really important, because these are people's identities and we don't want to be assigning a word to their identity, especially if it's an identity they don't identify with.
No, thank you for bringing that up, because that's one of the points I want to speak to right from the beginning. So as we frame the content going forward, that is so great. So thanks, Ivy. Anyone else want to speak to what words matter, people first concept is about? Have you folks seen it before? Thumbs up or thumbs down? So you have, okay. So general question, how easy is it for folks to get into treatment? I want you to think about that. And it's a very, very tricky general question. And I did that on purpose. So, and I say this all the time, some of us who are working in treatment, some of us working in mental health, prevention, medical settings, the biggest, not the biggest, one of the top three most commonly identified factors that is a barrier for folks to seek care is stigma. And we're always talking about stigma. It should never stop, because in our humanness and in these inequitable systems that we have to navigate and help other folks learn how to navigate for themselves, there's a lot of stigma related to people with substance use disorders, with mental health disorders, and so on. And even physical disabilities and all that. And so what we're trying to do here, SAMHSA has really tried to help us, has encouraged us to encourage you further to consider the words that we use. And so if you've been in the field any length of time, the terminology continues to change. And it just seems like almost anything that comes up in American culture, eventually after a while, it gets a negative connotation. And some of the words that we use in our practices, whether it's prevention, addiction, psychotherapy, a lot of even the clinical terms end up being more stigmatic than empowering. And the whole idea here is to engage folks and to help support them in their recovery and wellness process. And from that perspective, sometimes our language, even though we were taught certain things back in the day, our language today can mean something different, often very negative, very off-putting. And so today we're trying to encourage more intentional dialogue, more intentional use of certain terminology that's more inspiring to the client communities we work with, instead of something that maybe unwittingly may push somebody away. And that's the whole idea. It helps us to raise our awareness of where we're at, what we're using, and do the best we can so that person can internalize some support. They can see that we're really allies with them. And so there'll be some references to that here. It's not directly, it's still the same concept, no matter what language that you practice with your client communities. And so the whole concept is to be more recovery oriented and more empowering. Help people feel motivated enough and enough to think that we are there to support, and not to make them feel less than. And too much of the older terminology has had a lot of more judgmental terms. So some of that may come up in here. So that's why we always have to put it, and we always see it. And I think if I wasn't always required to put it, I would probably do it anyway. Because every time we talk about any content, we're not necessarily trying to teach you anything. Let me speak from the eye. I don't come in here trying to teach you anything from scratch. You're not an expert or a professional in your field because you got there by accident. You have knowledge, you have education, you have expertise, so all that is so, so important. And so what I want to come in here with is with the idea that maybe we can enhance what we currently know. And that's pretty much what I do. And sometimes I get to just remind you some of the things you forgot that you knew. And that's kind of neat, Okay, so let me go back to my slides. Let me see, what comes up next is, I think it's the logistical slide. Yeah. So far everybody's doing a great job about using the chat box, which is absolutely wonderful. You guys are so good at this because we've been doing this like now, it seems like forever. But I would hope what Ivy just did was she raised her hand when she wanted to speak. And because we have a healthy amount of folks on this platform, I would love to not miss your hand and not miss your voice or dismiss your voice. So it'd be great if everybody raises their hands and then I'll call on you. Is that okay with everyone? All right, there we go. So from 9:30 to 1:30, that's 4 hours. Being that is, yeah, that's 4 hours. I usually do this in 3, but today we got a lot of information to cover. So typically, I don't keep folks seated more than 90 minutes at a time. The science says that that's appropriate to give somebody a chance to kind of debrief. And so I was thinking that what we can do is go through the 2 hours, take a 20-minute break, or not 2 hours, maybe an hour and 45 minutes, take a 20-minute break and then come back and finish the rest. So are you folks okay with that? Or would you rather have two 10-minute breaks? So option 1, 20 minutes, somewhere halfway through, or option 2, 2 10-minute breaks. Put in the chat box. I like that, option 1. I like option 1 too, so thank you, I appreciate that. All right, so I didn't put any rules, but yeah, majority rules here. Okay, thank you, everyone. And lastly is the being present. It just required that you be present so we can justify sending you that certificate. It's our responsibility to make sure we don't send someone a certificate that wasn't at the training. And it wouldn't be fair for everyone else who is here. So, and so OASIS requires that we do that. So we ask your help for that. All righty. So here's a question for you. Anytime we speak about culture, and even the webinars or the trainings that I attend, one of the things I found that can be helpful is the opportunity for us to express ourselves. Sometimes we don't have that opportunity, that space, or that, to hear our voices when it comes to this subject matter. We're so caught up in our different responsibilities on a daily basis. So what are some of the things that you think we may need to keep in mind to make this a safe space for you all? Because this is really your space. I'm just navigating and guiding it, but this is your space. So what do you think? Any suggestions? Put it in the chat box. Or you can raise your hand. Respect differences. Thank you, Margali. Yes. It's always, that's a good old fashioned one, and that never gets old. Whatever perspectives or experiences we share, if we can do it from the I perspective, that would be great. Because there's so much autonomy within different settings, but there's even further autonomy within your individual practices and your processes. So assume good intent. I like that. Okay. It would be, can I add one if you don't mind? Stay curious. That's very cool. We're going to add that today. If you don't mind, I also want to suggest to everyone to keep an open mind and not to personalize anything that someone else says. Because I'm not here to correct you, but we are not here to correct each other because we're entitled to our perspectives. If it doesn't work for you, that's fine. I know when so one of the things that my husband has shared with me is one of the slogans he uses is like, if it doesn't apply, you let it fly. So if that's the case, work with it, because everybody's entitled to being where they're at, and that's fine. Okay. So, that's interesting, Forrest. Thank you. So wait, why am I talking? Would you like to elaborate on that one? Just so I'm clear, or the rest of
It's
it?
one of the tools that we use when we're in groups with people. So it's basically a way of saying think before you speak.
I like that.
So wait, why? So think, why am I talking? Why am I speaking? What is the relevance of what I'm saying right now? And it should fit what we're talking about.
I like that, because you need intention for that. You need to actually process. You have to think about it. That's great. Very good. Thank you for that. I'm going to borrow that one. I'm not sure I ever heard that. Always learn something new. Okay. Anything else you folks would like to add? Well, in that case, all right, as long as we keep the kind of the respect and the understanding and keep an open mind, I think we'll be fine, So with that, we will move forward. Thanks so much. So, okay, so the goals today is to instruct on Latino cultural dynamics that frame the dialogue between the provider and the client themselves. And so we're going to look at certain aspects of how culture is part of communication. And so we're going to kind of look at some strength-based strategies to be more effective with Hispanic and Latinx communities. And all I did here was generalize some terms. We're going to go over that. So, really important. Happy Hispanic Heritage Month. So for whoever identifies as Hispanic, Latino, or Latino reference group, congratulations. This is your month. And so I have to put this up from September 15th to October 15th. And we get to recognize the contributions that different members that identify with this communities have brought. So I want to not dismiss that. So let's talk about that language and the terminology. And so I found this and I thought it was so relevant to what we're going to be discussing today. And so folks in Mexico, in Mexico, when they hear the term Latinx, they're not necessarily sure. This is kind of what it speaks to, right? And in Argentina, as a matter of fact, why don't you folks tell me, what does this say to you? Because there's more to it than what I just mentioned. Anything comes up for you? Also, I'm seeing some things here. Everyone sees things differently, multicultural, not homogeneous. I'm from I am from Cuba. Nice now. It's a new term. Okay. Language inclusivity. Okay. Mary. Hi, Mary.
Hi. I have a lot of friends who have ancestry from the country of Mexico. And they will quickly indicate that they do not identify with any other term but Mexican. And that is their heritage, and they are very proud of it. And they don't appreciate being lumped into a different category of wording. They feel that it's very necessary to maintain this recognition of separateness, even though they may recognize and interact with and appreciate other cultures as well. They don't want to be divorced from their unique heritage.
Thank you, Mary. I think that's great. Thank you. All right. Anyone else wants to add? their perspective or what they understand from what this slide was kind of suggesting, because I like that Mary had shared some experiences from that from the community perspective. So there's some folks here saying perpetuating colonialism, using one term to blanket describe so many cultures. And we're definitely going to talk about that to a certain extent, again, to frame the context. It's important to always ask where they are from, quote unquote, and how they like to be addressed. Very cool. Some words in one culture may mean one thing, may be offensive in another. It's valid that many people think we are all Mexican, but in fact, there are many Spanish cultures. This is true. And so South American, two different Latinx, Latino, Latina refers to Latin America. Yeah, so we have some supposedly, so we have some definitions. It depends on what source you go to. And I will go over them. But when I look at this, and thank you for the comment. And I think Mary just kind of really hit it right on the spot, because the terms we use in this country that this country has developed to reference different communities. And when you go trace back to the countries of origins for a lot of these members, these words don't mean much of anything. They're not necessarily something, these are not terms that they use. If I go to Mexico, somebody's going to tell me that they're Mexican. So yo soy mexicano. Or you go to somewhere in Colombia, or you go to Peru, and I've been to Peru several times with work. And what we find is they're going to identify very specifically, and very much like Mary said, they identify with their heritage. In this country, we have certain terminology. And so let me just go through that first before we go into anything else. And so here I'm going to say to simplify the title, I did not put all of the names, okay? And but the content always references just about all of them. And so the names or the terms referring to the communities of Latin origin or from Spanish-speaking countries or folks who just identify with different communities, there are different terms. So Hispanic was the first one that was ever really recognized and suggested for recognizing people who used to fall under other. And so that's back in the late 70s during the ad hoc committee members that get together to be able to start to develop the criteria and the parameters for collecting data as part of the annual census. One of the individuals here was Mexican American, and she suggested the word Hispanic as a way to recognize this population. And so back in the 70s, it's also like when we think about the census, remember, that's a good way to collect information to help to understand where resources, where allocating funding is, where it needs to target. And so under other, you don't specifically allocate funding as specifically as you would with a particular community. And so Hispanic was born. And so that usually refers to language and those whose ancestry comes from Spain or Spanish-speaking countries. I don't have any, this comes from certain research data, but I have not found conclusively where these terms originated from. What I do know, because Hispanic wasn't always just Spain and so territories that Spain once ruled over, or Spanish-speaking countries, but that has been because it's Hispanic. They kind of squeeze in there the Spanish, and so now it's been, for a certain amount of time, it's been defined this way. So Hispanic is an umbrella term. Latino is another umbrella term that was developed after the Hispanic term was out, and it was considered more neutral because there were a lot of folks who identify with the community that did not come from places who originated as from a rule from Spain or from Spanish-speaking countries, but Latino was considered very neutral. And so a lot of folks had identified with that. Personally, and this is my own bias, okay, because I like to present you, the wisdom of the field and the research that comes from there. Personally, for me, I identify as a Latina. And so that's me. And a lot of folks identify as Latino or Latina. So Latino, it was a neutral term. That's one of the things that I liked about it. And that was before the Latinx and Latinx came out. So usually Latino refers to It's a geographical perspective for folks who come from specific Latin American countries, Caribbean, South America, Central America. Then we saw the term Latinx. There is no conclusive data or survey or study or article, scientific article that dictates the origins. So, but it is considered, the Latinx is considered gender neutral. So the Hispanic language and a lot of the traditional culturally related elements and values of the communities have always been very gender-based, genderized, and dominant, and male dominance. And so Latinx was a way for folks to think about identifying themselves in this country. And so folks don't, so they don't have to be, there's no presumption of gender with an individual. When we work with, we use inclusivity in how we work with trans or gender diverse individuals. We don't want to make assumptions. We actually really shouldn't make assumptions of anyone, but we really learned a lot about working with the community about how us making assumptions can really deter from us developing a rapport with an individual. So here's the problem with Latinx. So the problem with Latinx, right, is you can't really say it in Spanish. So the letter X is so easy for English language or American culture to refer to some individuals as Latinx. The thing with the Latinx is that in the Spanish language, X, the letter, is pronounced X. So we don't say Latinx. That's not in Spanish dialogue. It's just not. So this is an Americanized term, a construct, if you will, to refer to the population. The attempt is to not genderize anyone, not to make those assumptions. So another term that came up was Latina. And Latina is much simpler, and that's more from the group instead of from, Western perspective. And so Latina is like, if I were to say something, and this is the example I've been using lately. So if you say student in English, the way it translates in Spanish is estudiante. So you have an E, but it still doesn't genderize the person. So how neat is that? And that can be spoken in Spanish. The unusual aspect about all these terms is that many of them come from Western culture, but does not necessarily come from the community members themselves. And so it's interesting to see that, and I was at fault of this too at one time, that for traditionally the terms, the umbrella terms, even though we know there's a lot of diversity in the specific communities, the umbrella terms were Hispanic and Latino populations. And then somewhere along the line, really smart people who do all this research and studies decided to put Hispanic Latinx to be inclusive. Now, my own bias, this is just something for you to think about. My own bias is being inclusive is absolutely how we want to be, but we're not usually inclusive by excluding another term. So I think they missed the mark on that. So sometimes when you see the terms, their umbrella terms, what we will do in this, for the purposes of this training, is use these terms interchangeably, and you can use whatever term you are comfortable with. So I'll use different ones because I want to respect the different communities and different people, how they identify. And so in terms of references, if I'm working with a person, an individual, I would do what was said already. I would ask them, how did they identify? And I can work with them. And the important thing, and what's the important thing, what's the biggest benefit actually of us asking the individual how they identify? What would be your benefit as a provider when you do that? Go ahead, Forrest.
It's a way to build a rapport. You're getting closer to the person. They know who you are. You're getting to know them. And then also you're taking the time to find out about that person. So it's bringing them in closer to you.
Yeah, so you mentioned so many nice points. Thank you, Forrest. So the rapport building is really, it's really a nice way to invite the person into a conversation. And it's respecting autonomy. It's respecting how they are, who they believe themselves to be. We want to take the actual moment to acknowledge that by asking them. So we don't just run. I mean, this is not experiences that they tend to have with other places, but they have it with us. And so we have that opportunity. It also provides, like, so Forrest also alluded to this, was we get insight. So if somebody says, so if you're collecting the data using those closed-ended questions, you're collecting the data about, different races and a lot of different forms ask for races, not necessarily in ethnicity. And then some places ask for races and ethnicity, depending what tool you're using. And so, and if you say that to, and ask that to a person of some Hispanic background, whoever they identify with, many times, if you ask the race, they're looking to say their heritage, because that's their perspective. Just like what Mary was saying, it's that perspective. And that first slide just kind of speaks to that. When someone does that, it gives you insight into how they, not just how they identify, but the pride, because they go out of the way to tell you that. That says a lot about who they think they are. That's opportunities for us as a provider. The other thing is, not everybody fits the constructs that we in Western culture have developed. Just, we don't. They seem to want to put people in different categories, and you have to do something to be able to identify communities, to be able to tally up who's where, how to allocate fundings, but it should not be the mode of identification for the people we work with. Because even when we collect data, and this is, again, and I get a lot of biases I don't mind sharing with you. And so I love data. I'm geeky when it comes to data, because I think research informs practice, and data gives us insight. It gives us insight as to patterns and characteristics, different communities, different prevalence and issues, especially, whether it's opioids or whether we're talking about diabetes or, and so what I think about research is, it's kind of biased too when we are, or our tools can be biased because we're only collecting very generally identification information. So yes, if you identify as Black, we're going to collect that. If you're ethnic and you identify as Hispanic, we're going to collect that. But we're not asking anything more. With the Hispanic community, you have South Americans, you have, Honduras, you have someone from Belize, you may have someone from Mexico, you may have someone who's a Chicano, which is Mexican origin, but has been here a couple of generations or some length of time. There are differences. So you have Puerto Rican, Dominican, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of diversity within those two umbrella terms. So even when the umbrella term is not just Hispanic, Latino, it's Latinx or Latinx, it's a generalized way to refer to the communities, but we don't need to stop there. Because I was working with one organization, and I was suggesting, we're talking about data gathering, and I was suggesting, we were talking about the Black community at the time. I said, but why do you stop at Black and African American? What about the folks that identify as South African? What about the folks that identify as Guyanese, Haitian? You don't pick up on that, so how do you know who you're talking to? So it's really interesting how it works. It gives us an idea, kind of reference, and that's all it should be. It's not static to the person. It gives us a direction, and then we can explore further. So I want to put everything into context where we need to put into context. And take advantage of what we have available. And so that's where these terms come from. These terms are very defined. The Latinx are more specific. It did come from the Hispanic or Latino community. I will do my best to be as interchangeable as I can. I do try to do that because I'm very clear that I have one specific identity reference term that I use as part of my identity, but that's not the only one that exists. So I want to make sure that I am more inclusive. So I'll do my best to do that. You use what's comfortable for you. So now that we went through that, I said, so thinking about the Latino and Latina communities, let's think about why we need to be more adept at what we're doing. So let me just put this out, and this is this slide is still so good. The projection. Every year there's a population projection for race and ethnicity, and with the diversities within the population here in the United States, and it typically perceives where we will be at certain time ranges. And so by 2060, it is expected that the 335 plus million people that we currently have here, that's a lot of people, currently is at, it's like 62% white, and then the rest is an array of different diverse communities. By 2060, the different cultural communities collectively will represent more than half of the population in this country. Here's an interesting thing for you to know, that every projection that you can look at and read about has always underestimated, have been more modest than the actual numbers that come up when in the date ranges and the year range that they provide. So so if we have an idea that the group is going to continue to grow, I think it's important to note a couple of things. That we need to be adept because the diverse communities need our help. We have never seen the disparities to the level it is. We've been talking about that for decades, and it continues to rise. So we need to be more adept. One of the things that we're doing today is speaking to the Hispanic and Latino community in terms of communication, because engagement is key. There's also another thing, is that a lot of times the data or the information or the research that's available is very limited when it comes to the Hispanic and Latino communities. Is very limited when it comes to Latinx community in comparison to other cultural groups. And so, I remember I went to a TOT one time, and they were talking about how sometimes inadvertently we can make people invisible. And so sometimes when you're not collecting data from communities that obviously exist, you're kind of trying to make them invisible. Just because the Hispanic and Latino and Latinx communities are not considered racist doesn't mean they're not there. So that's something to think about. And so the projection is key. And we know that we have a lot of folks a lot of communities that we already work with. Okay. So large group questions. What I want to ask you is something real simple. So think of a time that you were speaking to someone. It doesn't matter whether you're professional, personal, you can do it personal if you want. So think of a time that you were speaking to someone and you didn't feel like you was heard. Right? So it could be work, it could be family, I don't know, medical appointment, shopping, whatever. And share why you think it happened. And did it affect how you went forward after that experience? Do you need an example? I need to kind of, I'm going to put the crowbar away. So, okay. So, and this is more of a recent example. Earlier this year, I went to see my primary care. So this is very real. So I went to see my primary care. I got that was in my primary care. No, it wasn't my primary care. I went to get a medical appointment for a particular health issue that I thought I had. And so I needed evaluation for it. So it was first time visit for this particular discipline. So I went in and, they always ask you, why you're there and all that. And that's really about insurance purposes. So I went in, I'm waiting for someone to come in to see me. They put me in one of those exam rooms. And then a young woman comes out. She has the whole doctor garb. So she's a physician assistant, I believe she was. So she comes on and she says, hello, my name is so-and-so. And I said, hi, my name is Diana. And I started to explain to her what I thought I saw with some symptoms I was having. It wasn't like more past than 30 seconds when the person interjected, completely cut me off and took over, looked at the file, said what recommendations, she was ready to walk out the door. So that's an example where I know I wasn't heard because I was cut off. It made me feel a little bit more leery, more careful of how I move forward and who I get as a resource. And that's for me because I use the information that I present to you folks, I apply it in my life wherever possible. And so what I did, so this is what I did. So what I did was I patiently waited for her to finish saying what she was saying. And I said, so now can you let me finish? Can I share with you what I was saying because you're missing some information? And then I shared with her part of the symptomology that she didn't refer to. And then it changed the recommendation. I will also say that I didn't go back. I got another resource. And that's me as a professional, and I'm familiar with a lot of the stigmatic and stereotypical type of services sometimes we get and all that. And I understand people can be in different places and different times. But for me as a consumer, as a patient, looking to get a service that I needed, it was so off-putting. It's like, okay, I think this, I felt like I should be somebody on a conveyor belt or something. I didn't feel like I was heard. So that's an example of like when I didn't feel I was heard. Except I did something a little different with it because I did try to get my needs met. and then I just moved forward differently. I didn't go back to them. I got someone else. So that's an example. So think of a time when you felt like you wasn't, it doesn't have to be as specific the way I said it. Think of a time you're talking to someone and you didn't feel like you were heard, or you felt like you were ignored, or like they waited to finish everything and came up with something that had nothing to do with what you said. You know, what was that? Do you mind sharing it with the group? And how was it that and how did you move forward from there? So I'm going to read what Katie put. Speaking with the city manager of a small city, and the information I was provided was important to a decision they were making. As I was speaking, I was getting a blank stare from the person. When I left, I realized they hadn't heard a word I said. He didn't accept that a woman could have useful information. Going forward, I will present information to someone else on his staff, a male, and let them present it to him. So you can develop your own strategy to work around that. Thank you, Katie. Anyone else? You don't have to share the exact information. How about we focus on how it felt and how you move forward with it? Okay, Forrest, go for it.
I guess if I'm being honest, it makes me feel invisible when people do things like that because I've experienced, I don't want to get too deep into my story, but it was a time when the doctor basically was not listening and he didn't pay attention and I could have died. And instead of me just dealing with him, I was like, you know what? Let me just take myself out of his care and go to a whole nother hospital because I don't even want to be bothered with the hospital now. Because I was that upset because you weren't listening. You didn't hear anything. You saw what was going on and you still didn't pay attention. So it made me feel invisible and not worthy of wanting to even be around that person. So I got even so upset that I was like, did what you did. I'm going to just find my own care. I'm not listening to anybody. I'm going to find my own.
Thank you for that, Forrest. You know, a lot of us are here long enough to know that we've had some personal experiences, and we also know we have to work with a lot of these challenges to get help for us, for services for the clients that we work with, not just for ourselves. So we're familiar with that. And so what I'm thinking here is, like Forrest was talking about, it's like, so how do we move forward? How do we understand how this might be very relevant to the communities that don't feel they're being heard, whether it's because of language issues or other communication cultural issues? And so how do we help them if we're kind of just, if we're creating a barrier that's keeping them away? So there's some really, really good dialogue in here and situations. Also, when I was younger, I didn't know how to speak proper English, and I realized that a majority of my teachers would skip me when I was trying to speak. I started to focus on clarifying my English since that. And that's even part of the research, so thank you for sharing that. We see that a lot of times that happens, it kind of bypasses, and because there may be perspectives or biases that may be part of that. Because that's when you're teaching, really, that's exactly when you want to be able, when you think there is not a lot of information coming from the person, you want to augment that. You want to give them information, or at least give them the space to be heard, to hear the voice so you can understand. And they didn't do that. So local farmers market, they're always trying to push me out or try to attend meetings to voice my concern, and it just angers me. So this is the funny part about it, is that when that we have options. We can find helpful strategies to work with the situation despite the situation, or it can do like very much not dissimilar from what Forrest was saying. It's like we got kind of go through feelings like, wait, I don't want to talk to you anymore. Why? There's no way I want to come back. So I'm thinking of that client who may have limited English proficiency, and they're trying to engage with somebody on the platform, somebody at your organizations, and they're being talked at, but not talked with. They're not feeling they're being heard. And if you're not motivated, you don't feel like you're being supported, why would you return? And that's the really important part of communication. This is with anybody. With Hispanic communities, it happens quite a bit. So it causes a sense of hopelessness in a way, like you put yourself out there, which for some takes a lot of courage. And then when met with an individual that doesn't hear you, it pushes you to stay in the background. And then actually, in something else that I heard was, sometimes folks won't get the care they need, and they gravitate to something they come up with on their own. It may not be healthy, may actually be detrimental, because we weren't in our ethical world, we were not making ourselves available because we didn't try to get past that barrier of communication. And so these are really good comments. Thank you, everyone. Let me use this last one for Susan. Had a client who continued to go to the ER because they were had extreme pain in their lower back because of the substance use history and use. The ER doctors gave her a pill and discharged her. This continued for 3 days. The third day, they went to advocate for her behalf. Spoke with the supervisor, determined she had dislocated disc. She was hospitalized. No one would listen to her because of her history. And I almost speaks like almost directly to that first slide I had on bias and stigma and in terms of the wording that we use. So good. So what we're trying to work on here, how do we engage folks? Despite communication issues, how do we engage folks? So it's not just logistical, it's about understanding that the person needs to be heard for us to be able to develop a rapport that can be fruitful in us supporting their recovery and wellness process. And that's essentially what it is. Nicholas, do you want to say that out loud, or do you want to just read it? So I don't read it.
Do you talk to me?
Who's that, Nelly? Go ahead, Nelly.
Yeah, I'm just saying that the world is full of people who has 2 mouths and no ears instead of 2 ears and 1 mouth. And they just don't know how to listen. So it's not personal. The thing that we have to keep the control, be patient, and try again with those type of people.
Okay. I think that many people are, thank you for that. I like that you said it's not personal.
You're welcome.
So that's one of the suggestions I said here, is for us not to personalize what someone else might be saying. So from the perspective of the provider, or anybody for that matter, I think people do the best they can with what they know. So if the provider is not exposed to these communication issues, if the provider has a bias, particularly with somebody in regard to substance use, we see a lot of that with our outreach communities, see a lot of that in terms of having to helping the community who are actively using to go for medical issues to a doctor, because the doctors, because of the substance use, they have their own bias and don't treat them or do something like in 5 minutes and try to discharge them. And so we see a lot of that. And so the idea here is, what can we do about that? And so let's think about the biases, perspective, and all that. We'll put that into context as we go forward. I'm going to show you a couple of slides, and we're going to keep on from there, because we have opportunities we can tap into. And the way I'm thinking about it, and a lot of the research has started to kind of had been referring to this, and many practitioners in the field and different disciplines I've spoken to, culture can be is often an untapped resource. We think about person-centered care, we think about strength-based perspectives, and the idea that someone's culture can actually be something we can incorporate and help support someone's recovery process with is something that not a lot of us do, and not many people do, but we have that opportunity. You have that great opportunity because you're resourceful, you're creative, you have that flexibility to be able to do that. Other disciplines may not, but other disciplines don't necessarily, some professionals may not necessarily be aware that there's opportunity there. So culture is an umbrella term too. It encompasses a lot of different things. It's mostly, behaviors, institutions, and norms. And that's really a layman's way of saying the commonly adhere to characteristics or practices within or ideas in a group. And then the group can be different groups. And so it includes what communities tend to practice collectively. But even if you get the trends of different communities, you also want to look at from the micro perspective. You want to be able to look at the individual. So the culture, beliefs, and languages, heritage, and values, huge part of what we can start to learn about and identify to be able to pair up and really partner with that individual to help them in their process. So it includes the beliefs, their laws, the customs, their resources, their experiences are hugely valuable here. Their expertise, their knowledge level, what their world looks like is going to help us understand how will he be best informed when we are trying to suggest certain resources and certain programs and certain opportunities for them? Because culture really speaks to the person's identity, who they are, how they feel, how they think, and we'll talk more about that. But it also has the way of us being able to start to understand who is this person. It's like thinking about the TV when back in the day, the TV had that big thing in the back. I almost forgot what that looked like. Everything is a flat screen these days. So it's the difference between the regular pixel frame to the HD frame. It's much more specific, much more refined. You see things clearer. And so that's the opportunities we have here when it comes to Hispanic and Latino culture. So, poll question. Good. We're going to ask you folks a question.
I have a quick question. I did put it in the chat, but I don't know if you saw it. Sometimes I'm keeping it on the eye. Sometimes I feel as though the community can be dismissive to me because even though I am Hispanic, I don't look it and I don't speak the language as proficient as I should because I am Hispanic. And sometimes they'll look at me like, oh, well, that I'm not Hispanic enough.
So when you say they in the community, are you talking about members who identify with Hispanic Latinos?
Well, the
everybody?
community that I am helping at the current moment. I've even gotten this in my own family sometimes too, though. So
I think anybody. I don't think that dismissiveness applies to any one particular group or any one particular person. I think that's
it just feels. And I know you're saying don't take it personally, but how can you not take it personally when it's more than one person that is saying this?
What I'm thinking is don't take it personal here, what we say on this platform.
Okay.
Out there, you have choices. Whenever you have an experience, and anyone else can kind of jump in here. When you have your own experiences, you have choices on how you can move forward with it. It can be a learning moment to help me better navigate my world without losing myself, or I can get upset and actually not access a much needed resource and hurt myself. Or I can also consider saying something where the provider can learn something different and may better help. So there's different choices. But I do understand that what you're saying is when someone's having that experience consistently, it's kind of hard to come out of that and be able to trust people. So when that happens quite a bit, and you folks can tell me more about that.
I mean, because what I'm being told is because I speak a little Spanish. I use my Duolingo. I use the Google Translate if I need to. My Spanish is just not great because my grandmother was one of those people where she was like, you don't speak no Spanish, you speak English because we need you to be Americanized because of the fact that you need to prosper in this country. That's how my grandmother was. Okay. So at this point, the only thing I could do is try my best, right? And what I'm getting is, oh, well, you don't speak the language. I need somebody who speaks the language. You don't understand what I'm going through because you don't look like me.
So you're talking about with the clients that you're working with. Okay. You shouldn't have to prove yourself to anyone.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, because you're presenting yourself.
That's not what I'm feeling.
Yeah, you're presenting yourself as a provider to help support them. And we can work around, we can work with what folks say. I don't think you understand where I'm coming from because you don't like me. I said, well, maybe I can work with you anyway. I don't have to necessarily kind of feed into what they're saying. I can kind of show them. I said, well, I'm here in this role to help support you where you're at. If it doesn't work out and you need someone else, we can do that. But if you don't mind, let's give it a chance and let's work with each other. And then when you build a rapport and they get to know you, they may be more responsive to you. That's what I would suggest. Because even folks who do identify as the same person as you are, as you identify, it's a matter of being able to maybe approaching it in a way that's more likely to open their minds to you. And I think that's important for us to do as providers because we got to engage with a lot of different types of folks.
Well, honestly, a lot of times it makes me feel as though they're scared. because
It
I'm
could be.
Black, and they don't want to. I don't know what situations they've had in the past, but that's what it makes me feel like. Like, I don't want to deal with you because you are Black. But then when they find out that I'm Puerto Rican, they're like, "Oh, okay, that's a little different."
But look at that. When they found out, it took a little time, but when they found out, they kind of felt more comfortable.
Yeah, but they got only comfortable because of the Spanish side. They weren't comfortable because of me personally. They were comfortable because they found out. You understand what I'm saying? That's something I
But
can't control. That.
that's a good thing. And if you're Hispanic, just let it be known so you don't have to keep going through the same situation. I mean,
Yeah,
if you
but I don't
know
speak
it,
Spanish like they do,
You don't
baby.
have to
That's
speak
the
Spanish.
problem. A
it
lot of them
doesn't
feel that
matter.
way because
Right.
because I am Spanish and I don't speak Spanish. They're like,
But it
you're not really
doesn't
Spanish.
matter if you do not speak Spanish. You just let it be known that you are Hispanic. And if that's what you experience, that's what makes them feel comfortable, then just let it be known right off the bat. And if you feel like it, then extend your time to learn the language.
Thank you for the suggestion, Tiffany. So here's what we're going to do for us going forward. I always think we identify ourselves as the helping a professional that we are. In time, we both, the client and us get comfortable with each other. Okay. Let's see if some of this content could further help you. Okay. All right. So let's talk about when we do talk about something. Wait a minute. We were supposed to do a poll. I don't want to get. I got too much here, so I'm gonna try to move it along. We have a poll. Clyde, do you have that available? Can you put it up? There you go. So here you go, folks. If an agency has employees who are direct, individualistic, and base their decisions on facts, they are an example of what type of culture? Low context, a foreign, a power distance culture, or high context culture? Okay. All right, we can end the poll and let's show the results. Because we're gonna go over this. All right, folks. So we got a nice healthy percentage that goes for low context culture. We got a few for foreign, a few for power distance culture, and got quite a bit also for the high context culture. So thanks for that, Clyde. So let me go to here. Let's talk about that because this has a lot to do with the communications within this Latinx community. And so let me go from here. So, and actually the right answer is low context culture. So that's really the correct answer. Now let's go through it now. So a high context culture, Latinx people tend to belong to a high context culture, which focuses on collectivism. So we've always heard that this group and in other groups too, but this group has always been referred to as a collectivist society. Collectivist means there's a lot of intersecting and interpersonal dynamics that go on that speak to even the one individual. There's a lot of nonverbal communication. There's an emphasis on the visual context elements of communication or relationships. There's also this thing about, and it's a real thing, about maintaining harmony. And this is kind of loosely translated from the research. There's this cultural value within the Hispanic, Latino, and Latina communities that speaks to simpatia. So it's kind of like a sense of congeniality. It's like the idea that you don't want to make waves, or you don't want to necessarily like be or admit certain things because it can have an impact, or it can cause you some distress, or you don't want to create discord because you want to keep the connection amicable. And so that is one of many values that were identified right back from 1998 when we started to understand what are the characteristics that we tend to see in this community. So Anglo culture is the most highly prized style of communication, and it's the most dominant one because this is the country we live in. It's assertive, it's direct, it's low context. You don't need a lot of information with that. And so when you're speaking in English. And so Latino culture, the communications, use a style that is more passive, provides high context. And somewhat, it can be indirect. So here's an example. So think about this. Low and high context communication, the Anglo story. And I thought this was a great reference to what we're speaking now. So somebody, their car broke down. Hey, my car broke down. Can I borrow yours? I got to get to work. Okay. So for a Latino, it can be like this. There's no absolution. Not everybody adheres to the values and characteristics of culture the same way. But for the Latino, we say, I was out shopping with Marta yesterday, and on our way back to our car broke down. I'm in a jam because tomorrow I need to go to my best friend's wedding. And then we grew up together, and he has always been there for me. Would you mind if I borrowed your car on Sunday? So you notice there's a lot more information that is insightful for the person hearing it, but that the person is providing, because that high context communication is also representative of the thinking process. Things are connected to other things. And so the expression in words, they'll give you most often all that extra information, which I think for most of us can actually be an advantage. So here's what I want to say. So when people are here, just because you come from another country or you have a different country of origin, and you're here in this country or whatever country you go to, you're going to take you with you. And so whether you're first, second, or third generation of whatever culture or family that you come from, you still tend to keep a lot of your cultural values. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't really necessarily speak to them. But what happens a lot of times is what you grow up with is what you tend to continue to do, even though you can alter it along the way. So here we have a Latino patient, passive. Assertive doctor comes across as blunt, terse, forceful, and rude. That almost sounds like my situation that occurred. And I wouldn't say that she was rude. I would say that she was like really quick, and I also start to understand that, possibly because insurance kind of gives you like 5 minutes to do everything yesterday. And you folks know that just as well as anybody who works in the medical community. Then maybe that was part of the reason why she approached me and interacted with me the way she did. But a lot of times the communication on the a Latinx person is more passive. They may be perceiving the person from another culture, and usually like the Anglo-Saxon provider, more like blunt, terse, and like very quick, and very specific. So that's maybe the perspective of the Latino person. Then you get the perspective of the Anglo provider that can actually be perceiving the individual as being more passive. Seems like they were accepting and resigned, maybe even they're uninterested or indifferent. So there's these different perspectives and different thought process can often be acted on, and those are part of the dynamics of that communication, that interaction, and that experience. And so what we want to consider is that many people, most Latinos or most Latinx persons, tend to grow up in environments or families that high context, type of interacting and communication is part of their world. Again, I'm not going to say absolute because maybe not everybody, there's a lot of levels of acculturation that we can talk about later. But one of the things we want to understand is that that's part of the reason why things are not just directly and simply translated. So can I have a volunteer to read the scenario, please?
I'll do it. A doctor asked a Latina patient if she agrees to cut back her hours at work until her back injury is resolved. Patient seems hesitant and eventually says yes. However, the patient is illegally employed and is afraid of losing her job if she cannot be there every day. The provider finds the patient to be shy and a bit guarded, but believes the patient agreed. The patient does not decrease her hours, and when she comes back for the 1-month follow-up appointment, her injury has worsened significantly.
Okay. And so what are we missing here? Thank you, Christina, for reading. So thinking about this, and I'm going to leave this off for a minute, and think about this. And so there is a lot that on the patient side that they're not necessarily speaking to, nor are they being asked about. And so even though this patient agrees? You know, there's a tendency to not make waves and like really think about, yes, okay, you're the person of authority, you're the expert, you know what I should be doing. But there's a lot more to that if someone else asks about them. And the provider has their own perspective about the behavior of the individual. Okay. And it comes out a little bit in the next meeting. So what do you think they could do? How can the provider engage with this person a little differently? Yeah, we're definitely missing an effective communication. Yeah, explore the hesitation. I mean, you certainly want to like come back and start to kind of understand. So what were the barriers? What was it that got in the way of adhering to the recommendations? So yeah, thank you for that. So the provider can pay attention to how things are said, not just what is being said. So many times, and this is for some folks, many times in the community, a yes is almost like saying a no. When people like to be polite, they're very respectful of people with expertise and people of authority and with each other. They tend to not, again, it's not that we're not making waves, but it's more like trying to be respectful. And so sometimes a tentative yes can actually mean no, I am too polite to tell you in English. So it's best to fully explore any hint of hesitations by Latino patient before moving on to the next topic or question or even the next appointment. And so one of the things that we do a lot of, and I don't know how you have not gotten this, but you have, but most of us understand about the idea of offering information and asking the person to reframe back to you, to tell you back what they think they understand. And so that's an opportunity that was missed here. And so we're going to talk about the open-ended questions when we get to it. So these are the different perspectives from the Latino community. There's such a thing as like battle of managing language barriers. This is from the community themselves. There are folks who have been here a few generations who are highly monolithic when it comes to their language. They're more about speaking the Spanish language, whatever dialect is speaking, and they're not necessarily as proficient with English. And so having to be able to like, being able to try to discuss maybe certain situations, depending on the resource that you're accessing, or maybe a situation with your child in school, you know, maybe a situation you want to share with your treatment provider, or maybe your peer recovery coach, peer specialist, so or mental health specialist. You know, like sometimes being able to try to say certain things in English when the person thinks in not in the Spanish language, more from a collective perspective, that can be really, really difficult for a lot of folks. And so there is a preference for bilingual providers. I'm going to take it further and suggest not just bilingual, but bicultural, and we'll talk more about that. Sometimes there's a negative bias toward the interpreted encounters. And I think that's speaking very much to like, to some of the things that I think Forrest was speaking about, and some of you folks already start to speak to. There are individuals and communities and families that do know enough English to get their needs met, you know, when it doesn't require much of a conversation, and then just move on and keep it to their world where they're only speaking Spanish. And so, in one example I can give you is when our offices were on 23rd Street, and we were on 23rd between 5th and 6th, closer to 6th. And one of the things, I had an experience one time when I went downstairs to the pharmacy. You can get anything at the pharmacy there. And so if you want some quick chocolates or some quick whatever, you know, you can go there. So I went downstairs. I was in the area where they had the pharmacy part of, what was it, CVS or Wayne Reed? I don't remember. And the pharmacy part. And there was an individual trying to engage in conversation with the pharmacist. The pharmacists were by themselves, and they clearly could not speak Spanish. So they asked me, they happened to see me in the background. So they asked if I can help translate. You know, this individual had a prescription that was part of a prescription for medication for a particular illness. And it was part of a promotional opportunity to get the prescription without any copayment, without any insurance. And if it wasn't that somebody was able to help him with translate with what he was saying to the pharmacist, then he wouldn't have been able to get his medication, his prescription filled out. And so that's pretty huge. Yeah, that's a huge privacy violation for sure. I also saw that the young man did speak to me, and I said, if you're all right, I can do that for you. And so he said, yeah. It was a very limited, time limited opportunity for him. What my concern was that the individual, the pharmacists themselves, like they didn't have that at the time. This was a while ago, but at the time they didn't have any kind of language assistance services, which should be done. If you're in a place like Chelsea, which is hugely diverse, how could you not have that? And so it kind of speaks to and translate into how it might look like in our world. In our world, we want to make sure that we meet the needs of the community members. How do we make that happen and not allow that barrier to stay in place? And so that was an example of that. So fear of being a burden. A lot of folks just do not want to be too don't want to be a bother. And I've seen that a lot with my aunts and my uncles. It's like they just don't want to be a bother to folks. So they don't necessarily share more information than they're asked. Stigma and discrimination due to language barriers. And I think some of you folks already spoke to that. So language barriers that have been reported, this is some data that's interesting. They're more likely, Latinos or Latinx persons are more likely to report poor communication with the health provider. So there are some folks, according to this one article, 57% of Hispanic adults surveyed were experienced a language or cultural barrier in the healthcare system. 44% was due to a cultural barrier, and that can be a cultural barrier. It can be a bias on the provider side. It can be that there are certain specific cultural attributes that maybe the person doesn't recognize. So 49% was a language barrier because the communication wasn't key. 57% that it was one or the other. And so other barriers include, and let's see where we see ourselves here. So the other barriers that the communities tend to speak to is, sometimes that the words that the provider is using is like, they don't necessarily understand. Like when I was doing direct services, I was not supposed to use the dialoguing that I use with my coworkers, with my peers. When we talk about clinical situations and we talk about certain terms that we use for certain conditions or circumstances, I can't use that with a patient or a client. And so sometimes folks use that kind of verbiage and you kind of lose the clients. And so emotional barriers and taboos, lack of attention, interest, distractions. Like, don't be on your phone if you're speaking to a client. Don't pick up a phone in the middle of a conversation or when they're trying to share something with you. So all kinds of distractions. If somebody comes into your office when you clearly had it, closed because you're in a session with one of your clients. So there's a whole lot of different ways that distraction can reflect. And certainly irrelevance to the receiver. Differences in perception and viewpoint, differences in language and understanding. Sometimes unfamiliar accents. Sometimes someone is speaking English very clearly, but the strong accent makes it difficult for someone to understand. Expectations and prejudices, which may lead to false assumptions or stereotyping, and cultural differences of all kinds. And so here's something really interesting. So nearly 6 in 10 Hispanic adults have had a difficult time communicating with a healthcare provider due to a barrier, one language or culture. So there is this one, I captured some anecdotal quotes and information from this one study that came out. So when I tell them I don't understand them, they'll bring someone over to speak to me in Spanish. And I don't understand them either. We didn't grow up speaking that formal Spanish, so I have no idea what they're saying. And this is coming from an individual who is Puerto Rican, raised in New York. And sometimes what it speaks to is the use of someone speaking a Spanish or maybe an interpreter. So the frustrations can include, along with communication challenges, some folks are concerned about the language and cultural accommodations for community, for people who are seeking long-term services. So this individual, Mr. Torres, one of the things that was about his experience, he was trying to ascertain or access some services that he was hoping to get for himself on the long term. So he wasn't confident that he'll find a culturally sensitive nursing home. And that can be very, very realistic in many people's worlds. And so he was trying to advocate for himself to find resources and see what he can put in place as he gets older for when he needs it. But if a nursing home is not culturally informed, and then he may have more challenges, then it might make it uncomfortable for him to stay there. He said, "I'd rather just live alone and poison myself by accident rather than stay in one of those homes right now." And he was thinking about, the monitoring of medications for different medical issues that he had, that nursing homes are good for doing. And he was actually thinking about, he might end up being like that because he couldn't find a nursing home that can accommodate him in his cultural perspective and his ways. And so interpretive services, 26% of adults surveyed report communicating through an interpreter. 52% family members acted as the interpreter. Isn't that interesting? So there was this other article that I found. It was a battle to say anything. I couldn't ask why they had to get so many vaccines or why not. I battled for so long. Other mothers described the need to switch primary care providers to maintain and access bilingual providers. So, first question, what are the challenges of using a family interpreter? What do you folks say to that? I'm not going to ask if your organization ever had to use it, but have you ever witnessed a situation where a family member was used as an interpreter? Okay. All right. So some of the challenges include inaccurate delivery of information from lack of privacy, not wanting family to know, not understand medical terminology, not professionally trained, confidentiality, sensitive information that may not want to share. Use of children and language services instead of adults. Sometimes if the news is especially detrimental, might soften it. Oh, excuse me, that's very good. Lack of access to, let's see, that was this indigenous language interpreters. These are really, really good comments. Does anybody want to speak to it? My mouth is getting dry. I need help. So I need someone else to speak to it. Hi, Lynn. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm a mental health provider and I can share, I work with high school students. And when we've had other therapists who use like older brothers or sisters to translate in Spanish, and you can tell that there's times when they would pause to see how they want to share this information with the parent because they might not want to be in therapy, or they don't want to tell the parent, like if there's a risk, a safety concern, they want to be like very sensitive to how they say it. But since it's safety concern, we have to straight out say like there's a risk of suicide. And so the information might not be clearly translated because the family is really sensitive to how the parent might hear it, or because they don't want the parent to really know what's going on. So I think that a lot can be missed.
A lot of points. Thank you, Lynn. Esther? Hi, good morning.
Yeah, I was the one who noted about having a lack of access to indigenous language interpreters. And for the example I was thinking of for a while, I was a case manager for unaccompanied minors in South Carolina. And there were a lot of children from Central America who spoke indigenous languages and just very little Spanish, like just a couple words. And luckily I was working for an agency that did have access to a language line that would be able to support indigenous language interpretation, but it was very difficult because there were so many different languages, and without like the proper knowledge, I just kind of went based on what the kids would tell me. And I remember one situation I felt particularly embarrassed because I was working with a child that was going to be aging out. She was going to be turning 18 very soon. And she was in a pretty dangerous situation. And she told me that the language that she spoke was Kikchi. And so I got an interpreter, but when I called the interpreter line, I was telling them I need a Kikchi interpreter. And they were like, how do you spell that? And I didn't know how to spell Kikchi, so I just went on Google and I wrote it out how I thought it was spelled. And then I just spelled out what came out on Google. And then I scheduled my call with my my client, and the interpreter spoke Kiche, not Kikchi. And so I got on the call with the child, ready to chat with her and the interpreter, and I started speaking, and the interpreter started translating, and then the child said, I don't know what language they're speaking. I think they're speaking Kiche, not Kikchi. And I was like, well, that was a miscommunication, because I know what I was saying, but I didn't know how to spell it. And because, you know, there was just no way like to navigate that situation any differently. We ended up having to reschedule with the proper interpretive services available, but that was just like a nuance that I wouldn't have known how that language was spelled to be able to provide to the interpreter services. And it just made me feel pretty embarrassed that I got the wrong interpreter, and I wished there was a different way, a more reliable way to make sure that I was getting the right interpreter the first time, and had that available to the child at the time that we had scheduled.
What an interesting situation, but I think we need to have those experiences in order to understand or reiterate that, you know what, wait a minute, we have to be a little bit more specific than what we're used to. That was great. Thank you for sharing that, Esther. Brenda? Hi, good morning.
So I'm from Puerto Rico. I have an American father and Puerto Rican mother. I grew up there on and off, but as you can tell, I don't have the accent. But what I brought is people are like, oh my gosh, you speak Spanish, you can translate. Different countries, different dialects, right? But then what I've also done is I used to be a juvenile probation officer and speak it, but I'm lost for words at times. And I did, when it came to my teenage kids on my caseload, I would let them translate, but I let them know I know what you're saying, because I know what they're saying. It's just hard for me to express it without having to look it up. So I told my kid that there was no breach of confidentiality because it was him and mom. So they were both supposed to know the information. And I'm listening to him, and it's like he did not tell her what I told him to say. And like they said, they may be fearful of saying the wrong thing, or they may be like, oh, I'm going to tell her something different so I don't have to do it. And I just looked at him, I'm like, that is not what I said. I said, you tell her what I told you. And he just gave me a cocky grin. And then he turned around and said what he was supposed to. Yeah. But also, I worked at a preschool, and you would have 4- and 5-year-olds translating for mom.
That's tough. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. There is a video, really good OMH video about why we need culturally and linguistically appropriate services. I didn't include it here because I wanted to focus just on Hispanic Latinos, but I will speak to it in the sense, and like you folks already started to speak to it. You know, sometimes we get in a situation where we think it beats a blank, and so we use family members. That should never be the case. Some of the cultural beliefs and practices and characteristics of different communities can be seen in the family. And so Brenda reminds me of, I'm going to touch on what Esther said, but Brenda and Melissa, Brenda reminds me of how the cultural values that people practice within their families, if you're not in the business of trying to hurt your family members and you're translating for them, guess what? You may not translate that information, right, with the intensity or the urgency or the specificity that it requires for the other person to get the information. So that's just a kind of out there, But without even thinking about that, our ethical responsibility is for us to be transparent and clear. Us. It's not the responsibility of any family member or anything like that. That's outside of ethics. Those are like ethical violations. We don't do that. Those are protocols that can really get us, not just us, but our organizations in trouble. You know, and why would you put anybody else in that position? Whether it's a child, another family member, and another person. And so we really don't want, we want to move away from that. What I was thinking about is how the language assistance services that we do have available, how we could be using them. And so I'm wondering how often has, how many people have used an interpreter in the last 12 months? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Mostly down, okay. So many of us can actually speak the language of the community. What would be the challenge in working with using an interpreter? Esther gave us a great example of one of the challenges. If you consider what Esther had just shared about, you know, getting an interpreter, which was great. You want to get language assisted services if you're not speaking the same language and you want to communicate. So how do you ensure that the interpreter that you're accessing is appropriate? What do you do? One of the things to know is when you're looking for someone, looking for an interpreter, understand, first of all, not everybody speaks Spanish the same way. There's different dialects, there's different versions of Spanish. And I'm not talking about the Castilian Spanish. I'm talking about there's a lot of indigenous nuances to how Spanish is spoken, depending on the group you're talking about. So what Esther is saying, was mentioning, and I think, and what Lynn was talking to also, I'm going to share with you what happened to me a couple of days ago. I was doing, a judge came up to, I work with drug courts too. And so the judge had shared with me about how he had someone in front of him, someone at the bench, and he had the counsel for the defendant and or the person in front of him. And he had other staff there. And so they were using an interpreter to interpret what the Spanish language, in Spanish language, what the individual was saying. They were not very good with the English, just to try to get some clarity. So the judge had gotten that access and to do that. And so what was interesting is, as they were trying to dialogue with the interpreter involved, someone else is in his courtroom said, that's not what she said. She understood the language, understood what was being said, but she was not a trained official interpreter, but she was serving another capacity during that hearing. And so the judge didn't realize that. Judge really thought that this, he was doing the appropriate thing, accessing interpreter to speak Spanish, and that because there was a lot of nuances and related information that did not translate clearly until they got the correct interpreter. So what does that speak to? It speaks to the idea that Spanish is not directly translatable and that there's different language. The same language that's referred to as Spanish and very generalized is not the same language that everybody speaks. So how do we ensure we can use an interpreter appropriately? So very much like Esther, if Esther had the right spelling from the beginning, but she learned afterwards, but we have to know from the individual, we have to get that information in what kind of Spanish language they come from. They speak, what is that their preferred language, what's their culture? Because it starts to give you insight as to, okay, we need an interpreter, not just speaks as any Spanish, but speaks this kind of Spanish. I speak Spanish. I read and write it, and I'm fortunate I still, I like to keep that part of my cultural identity. I don't always speak the same language as someone who's come from one of the indigenous tribe nations, tribal communities from down in Mexico who come into California. I cannot speak to everybody exactly, and sometimes I need help. So the first thing is I need to know that I sometimes need to step back because I don't necessarily, I want to be clear with the person. I don't want to miss a word, and so part of that is understanding, okay, where does the person come from, and give that information to see if the interpreter can come. Because we've had interpreters that say they're experienced and they're familiar. They're not necessarily bicultural. And so if you speak a Spanish that you speak like in Honduras, it's going to be different than the Spanish you speak in the Dominican Republic. And so that is really important. What is the disadvantage of that? It's like you might lose the opportunity to continue building a rapport. And we want to keep people engaged. Go ahead, Ivy. I see your hand. Thanks.
I was gonna share like a super short anecdote. In 1980, there was a case of someone named William Ramirez in a hospital in Florida, and the interpreter interpreted the word intoxicado as like use of drugs, when really the family member was saying maybe he ate something bad. And turns out they treated him like a drug overdose, and he had a problem, and he had a brain bleed, and he actually died because of this. So yes, so like this is literally life or death situations. Like people don't think of language as life or death, but it really can be. So I was just gonna share what I do with a family that speaks Haitian Creole. Is the first, like after we do the introductions, one of the first questions I ask my family is, can you understand the interpreter okay?
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that. I wasn't aware of that case. But you know what you suggested is something I suggested to the judges. Like, well, how can you make sure you go forward differently? So first of all, well, ask the interpreter, what kind of Spanish do they know, and ask the client. Even after the experience, can we ask our clients is, how was it, like what Ivy just said, how was that experience working with the interpreter? Did you feel like you were being heard so they can understand? And sometimes you have other opportunities where other folks are in the room. He was lucky enough to have another person in the room to help him understand, oh, they have to be more specific. Spanish is not just one set of language, and that goes. And English is different. There's no dialects of English. You have, I find it, and for me, I think English can be very limiting, but then it's because I'm from a more collectivist society, and when I speak Spanish, you have more words to be more descriptive, which I think is an opportunity for us. But and English can be very limiting, but it is the language of this country. It's the first or most spoken language, and so not everyone can express themselves appropriately using whatever language they know, even if they're very proficient. Sometimes they cannot be as descriptive as they would be if they were using their native language. And so these are things to think about in terms of, what do we do when we get language assistance services and then use an interpreter? Well, it's not just enough to just say the general term Spanish. Just like it wasn't enough to just say Hispanic or Latino. You got Latina, you got Latinx, and then underneath those umbrella terms, you have very specific cultures. That's insightful. We want to use that same concept when we access language assistance services. Experienced interpreters understand how to manage linguistic and cultural differences between speakers, and that has to do with the bilingual, the bicultural piece. It has to do with someone who understands what are the different communities in your different Latino communities that you have in your area. I think that helps us understand that we really should be mindful of not just that we have general Hispanic communities, and sometimes we get that data from demographic reports from my area, but specifically, who are these folks? What are the languages they're speaking to? So use a bilingual and preferably bicultural interpreter for cross-cultural meetings. And as we keep going forward, we want to consider how other aspects of culture actually does impact. And so cultural dynamics of communication. So what is cross-cultural communication? How do you define that? Okay, I'll tell you. Cross-cultural communication is the exchange of information between people from different cultures, and it does encompass the verbal, nonverbal, written communication. The cross-cultural communication is also an expression of the individual's culture. Something important to know. And so when we do language assistance services, to the individuals who have limited proficiency, let's let them know that they can actually have that when they're accessing other resources in the community. I should have had this slide before. I used to have clients who never knew that the hospital could provide them an interpreter, at no cost to them. And so they didn't know that. They wouldn't know that unless I tell them. And many places do not ask preferred language. This is something, for many of us, we're federally mandated to ask what the preferred language is, even if English is spoken very clearly. And so we can inform all individuals of the availability of these language assistive services and ensure the confidence of the interpreter. And we can also provide easy literature, like brochures that are simple to read, and let it be reflective of the languages in the community. That means you need to know who's in your community. Tapping into some of these free resources or from your grant managers, from those federal funded opportunities that you have, finding out, where, what are the demographics and languages spoken in your area can begin to give you insight. And so community representation with bilingual, bicultural counselors and peers and resource matching. So cultural communication is a way of thinking and whereby one picks up a set of attitudes, values, norms, and beliefs. And so they're reinforced within the group. And that's where we see a lot of the trends and characteristics that tend to be adhered to by many people in a certain community. The thing is, when we start to learn about any particular community, which is insightful, which is nice, but it's not static. Every person is very dynamic. When you get some insight as to what communities tend to adhere to, what values, what belief systems, what practices they adhere to, then you want to know, then at least it gives you enough information where you can know how to more culturally informed questions, how to ask those open-ended questions that are more culturally targeting, so to elicit information from the individual to better help you help them. And so sometimes there's an assumption of similarities. We know there's a lot of language differences. And sometimes when we're not clear, we have a lot of misinterpretation of what that nonverbal language might be. A lot of times when we see someone folding their hands, and their body, we tend to think that that person is feeling guarded. And that's kind of one of the first things that come up. But it's not always the case. It could be that somebody has their hand folded because they have a stomachache, or because they don't know what to do with their arms and or they're more like nervous than they are relaxed. And so it may not, so it's very tricky with that. It's really a collective of different cues that can help you ask for information to help you understand what you think you see. So preconceptions and stereotypes is on us. We really want to undo that, not let that be part of the filter of the lens that we used to meet folks with. Sometimes there's a tendency to evaluate folks, on what we see. Cross-cultural communication can, also can have a lot of high anxiety with folks who are frustrated, or folks who are having a hard time to be very specific about what they want and how they're feeling, and trying to share that with you. And stress and trauma is always part of all this. So it's really about, it's about understanding what can possibly be part of the communication dynamics. So here's what I'm going to ask you all to do. I'm going to ask you all to break up in a group, okay? I'm going to give you, so we have a lot of folks here. So maybe, wow. So Clyde, can we make this groups of 6? Okay. And so I'm going to give you, I think, 15 minutes to see how much you can kind of come together and discuss. So in the chat box right now, I just uploaded a handout. Click on it and open it up. If you can save it to your desktop, that's fine, but as long as you have it open, that's great. When you're in groups, someone will have that handout available, at least. You should all have it available to you. So what it is contrasting values. That's what I call this one. So for each issue, we're going to talk about, I would like you guys to talk about, choose the statement for yourself and that reflects what you were taught growing up. It's at the top of that handout. Choose the statement that best reflects what you were taught as you were growing up. There's no right, there's no wrong. And if it encourages a discussion with all of you, that'd be great too. So do 15 minutes. Matter of fact, let's not do 15 minutes. There's quite a few here. Let's give you 20 minutes. Are you folks okay with that? 20 minutes to have a discussion with each other? Nobody wants to say yes or no? I'm gonna force you, no. So no, because you have a lot to go through. If you finish, you don't all have to agree, but you do have an opportunity to share with each other why you chose a particular response that you think is appropriate because that's what you grew up with. So do that. We're going to give you 20 minutes. We're going to put you in groups of 6. You have the handout, and then we're going to come back and see how far you went, and then we'll come back and process as a group. Okay? All right. So I want to tell you, so thank you for doing this. It's such a great conversation start. This is a very, very, very old group activity, but I think it still has so much impact. And so I'm sure we're gonna hear that from you folks. Okay, so so instead of me going by group, because there's a lot of groups here today, by individual hands, does anyone want to suggest? I want to kind of at least cover 3 of them, okay? Because I'm looking at the time. At least cover 3 that you thought were really outstanding. So somebody mentioned the one that they want to cover first, instead of just going through all, because this is 13. I don't want to go through all of them. There's a particular messaging that is common to all of them. So, okay, Forrest, lead us off.
Well, one thing that we were talking about in our group is that all of us still address adults by a prefix. Either it's Mr. or Miss or Mrs. We never address any adult by their first name. And that's something that we learn being children, that you just don't do that.
Which number is that one?
It's a combination of a couple of them, I think. I think it was number 3. Well, on our screen, it was number 3. And it was informality versus formality. And then there was another one that was on there too. Thank you, Dan. Hey, brother.
Okay. So
But yeah, we all agree that none of us it would feel awkward to call an adult by just their first name without putting something on it first, by putting that respect on their name first, by giving them a Mr. or a Mrs. or Miss title before saying their name. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And so you're comfortable with that. You would be uncomfortable not doing that. Okay. Okay. Fantastic. All right. There's another one. Either your perspective on the same one that Forrest talked to, which is the number 9, with a little bit of the others, or whichever one that you thought kind of really stood out for you. Hi, Ivy.
Hello. So I think with the Spanish language, we have the usted register. So off the bat, we can already say if it's a formal versus informal conversation. And I think with English, maybe it makes sense to want to tack on that honorific in front of the name to add the formality to the conversation, because there isn't that difference in register with the way you conjugate the verbs.
Okay. Okay. All right, you're getting a lot of stuff that's coming off of this. Can you folks give me a specific one and what you chose and why you chose it? Or I can pick on you. Would that be better? I sure can. Miss Angela, which one kind of stands out to you, and what did you pick?
Mine was individual versus family welfare. That one I think kind of bugged me a little bit. This is about my own personal culture, my family, because it was always perceived that we were a unit, but at the end of the day, it became very individualized. But the whole unit didn't come together unless someone died. Okay, it's so like, oh, we're family, thicker bloods, thicker than water, but you didn't really hear that like as we moved every day.
Okay, so your initial choice was which one?
So I felt like mine was probably A.
Okay.
But the family felt like they wanted to be B.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Thank you for that. Okay. Mr. Dan. I'm trying to salutations myself, folks, as you can tell. Dan, which one did you, Mr. Dan? For the Dan Outlet? which one kind of stands out to you, and what did you pick?
Mr. Dan. Oh,
yeah, I'm trying to sound it out. It kind of feels weird, but I'm doing it.
I was just in a 6th grade class yesterday. They were dressing me just the same, so it's quite all right. Maybe I'll piggyback on Forrest's talk about formality, informality. Maybe it seems a little more like he was focused on like stranger interactions or like client interactions, things like that. I kind of want to refer to a few scenarios. So first we discussed like that more based in family culture, and being in our youth, we would address like cousins as aunts or uncles, second cousins as aunts or uncles. But once we reach the age of 18, adulthood, then we would drop that prefix. Maybe some wouldn't do the same with their actual aunts and uncles. But so there's that example that we touched upon. And then a place that I want to go that's, kind of client based-esque, if you will. I've got a huge background in retail. And I very rarely addressed anyone by Mr. or Mrs., Miss, their last name in this setting. I would always address them as their first name, just because, it's situational. And I think that's a word that came up very frequently in our group's discussion as well, is just the word situational. So it's like, is informality acceptable, or is formality essential? Is it necessary?
Okay, very good. Thank you. So you have some skills with you into the work that you do from your other profession. That's kind of neat too. Okay, Esther, which one stands out for you?
Hello. So I had a great group. We did a lot of chatting, a lot of sharing. It was very interesting to hear about different upbringings. And we really focused on the ones that were on the screen. We didn't really go through the handout too much, but one that I thought was interesting was the eye contact, particularly for myself, because I never really got instruction from my parents to make eye contact when speaking with them, which was pretty different from some of the other members on my team, where they were told like, it's disrespectful if you don't look me in the eye when you're talking to me. I didn't really get those messages growing up. I kind of learned from observation to make eye contact with people when they were talking to me. However, I did share that I've noticed as I've gotten older that I will make eye contact with people when they're talking to me, but I find it harder to make eye contact when I'm speaking. And I'm wondering if that's just a glitch in my brain where I find it easier to speak when I'm looking around than when I'm looking at someone's eyes. And that could also be a, after effect of not being given direct instruction of like, don't look someone in the eye or do look someone in the eye. And something else that we chatted about, which I think has come up for a couple of people as well, is the informality versus formality. And a couple of members in my team were sharing that, they were instructed to be formal with people in authority, like a teacher or, an adult that they were not like close family or friends with. And I shared that I had a dual messages growing up because my parents are from different countries. My mom is from Colombia and my dad is from Cuba. And if you know anything about those cultures, Colombians are incredibly formal. Their Spanish is really professional. It's very clear. And Cubans are quite the opposite. They tend to use a lot of slang and friendly language. So I got two very different messages growing up there, and I find that I'm often straddling that. And what I do is typically I'll use my Cuban Spanish with family and friends, and I'll use my Colombian Spanish at work, which isn't always great, especially when I'm trying to build rapport with clients that might be new to the country, because they are really affronted by the formality in my Spanish. So it's just kind of tough to switch gears there, because I hear my mom saying, like, you need to be professional, you're at work, which is true. But I also want to make sure I'm building rapport with my clients. So kind of that duality there. We did talk a little bit about a couple other ones, but I feel like those are the ones that stand out for me.
Thank you so much, and so well articulated. So I appreciate that. So let's work off of that one. In terms of both eye contact and the language. And so when we think about how we grew up and what worked for us or what we got accustomed to doing, and there are times where it seems like when we think about what worked for us, one of the things we want to be mindful of is that because we may identify with a particular group, whether it's, you know, by race, gender, or situational, just to use that word that Dan brought up. So sometimes we might use whatever worked for us with that person. We don't always know it's going to work for that person, or we have a certain way of communicating with most people, so we use it with everybody because it's been effective. But we don't always know that it really is effective. So in terms of what works for us, that's great. I would ask if did anything change as you were growing up? Because Esther kind of alluded to that too. Because what you learn as you're growing up, sometimes certain things happen. So you have certain experiences or certain things, or maybe you get educated in some things and it changes. You know, and the longer you're here in this country, it's likely to have some kind of impact on you where it may change what you learn. And so how do we work around that, understanding that those levels of evolution, I would say, can also affect or impact how we see the person and what may be happening with them. In other words, whatever I grew up with is not necessarily what you grew up with. Whatever I grew up with that I don't do anymore might not necessarily be what you do now. Different things, you know, that push and pull aspect with different people. So when you are communicating with someone, let's say someone you identify with, someone you represent, you know, whoever you are on this platform, do you kind of just automatically just start speaking the language the way you were taught? Do you think that helps you?
I'm sorry, Diana, can you please repeat that last part, the question?
So when you use what you've been taught as you were growing up, do you use that same approach with other folks? Do you automatically just do that? So with the people that seem to identify with what you identify with, that's what I'm thinking about. So I'm a Latina and I see another Latina person, and let's say okay, so I grew up speaking Spanish, so I'll use the Spanish that I know and I'll automatically start talking to the other person in Spanish. What do you think about that? Is that good, bad? Comments?
This is Lynn here. I would share that in those situations, I just start speaking Spanish, and I tell them like that my Spanish isn't perfect at the beginning, usually when at work, and then kind of see where the conversation goes, and then asking them if it's okay for us to continue the conversation in Spanish or if they would like us to get like additional support. And then kind of go based on what their feedback is.
Okay. All right. So I appreciate that you're trying to work with what their feedback is. I'm wondering if it would make sense for us to like understanding that we grew up with certain things or certain ways, certain mannerisms, certain communication styles that maybe we can consider that other people did too, and it's not necessarily the same, and maybe we could ask before we jump into making an assumption that, yeah, you speak Spanish too. Like if I were to speak Spanish to Forrest because I know he's a Latino, and then all of a sudden, then I find out, oh, he doesn't even speak Spanish. I jump to a conclusion. I jump to an assumption. It's not that the clients do, it's that I did, a provider. That's the whole thing. So as a person,
sometimes the reverse, I'm so sorry, but sometimes the reverse is sometimes the reverse is true too, because if you see my name, you don't know, and you don't see me on camera, you're going to make an assumption. But I'm half Mexican, and when people see me, they're assuming that I'm gringa. So it's the same thing, only in reverse.
It's still right. So we're still speaking about the assumption piece. Should we be assuming? We have contrasting values. We don't necessarily have the same values. There's so much individuality. If we're being person-centered in our practices, how are we being person-centered, but we are assuming that they speak the same language and they have the same approaches that we do?
Are we
So I'm
talking
thinking about it.
specifically about
Yeah.
languages, or are we talking about all of these contrasting cultural values, attitudes?
No, right now I was just speaking off of one thing, the language piece that Esther has spoken to in terms of, how of something that you grew up with and something that you might just act on, thinking that the other person grew up with the same thing. This is the whole activity is called contrasting values, attitudes, and behaviors. Did you want to speak to something different?
No, I just wasn't sure like what the scope of the question was.
Yeah, so because this is about language and communication. So I'm thinking like what we grew up with, and we are working with folks in this community. So not everybody grew up with the exact same experiences. So would we benefit from, at least we have the capacity, we have the skill sets, so we have the expertise. So if we learn that the other individual does prefer speaking Spanish, and we can ask what kind of Spanish, and maybe we can confer in Spanish after we elicit that from the person, as opposed to jumping in and making an assumption. What can make it an assumption? What can that end up translating as? Because then, so what I'm thinking is, because we've had people who, because a person is seemingly from bicultural Hispanic or Latino culture, that someone automatically starts speaking Spanish to try to engage them. That person may not even speak Spanish, or that person is assumed that they want to speak Spanish instead of the English that they know. So it's the assumptions, because if it comes out in one place, it can come out in other places too. Esther?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And personally, I will typically ask if I notice the person is struggling to communicate with me in English. I think quite a few of us on the call have had the experience where we can pass as a different race or ethnicity than being someone who would be Spanish speaking. In my experience, I think I'm pretty white passing, and a lot of people think that I'm white. So I notice, especially when I'm receiving some kind of service, that people will try to speak to me in English, who clearly Spanish is their first language or a different language is their first language. But I will always ask, I'll ask first, do you speak Spanish? Would you prefer if we continued this conversation in Spanish, because I speak Spanish? There was one instance recently where I had a maintenance situation at my house, and I was trying to talk to the maintenance worker, and it was clear to me that he was struggling to try and tell me what he was saying in English. And I just started speaking in Spanish. I didn't even ask him. I didn't say hey, do you want to just talk in Spanish? Because I know Spanish. And I felt so rude. And I think that's the only time I've ever done that, where I just start speaking Spanish without asking first. And I could see the switch in his brain, oh, I can speak Spanish now. But I felt pretty rude, just switching languages without really giving him a warning. So for the most part, I'll typically ask. And I think just I will experience people assuming that I'm white, there are people who might look like they speak Spanish and they're from a totally different country. One of my closest friends is from India, and she says that people come up and try to talk to her in Spanish all the time. And she's like, I am not Hispanic, but people just think that I am because of the way I look. So I'm also mindful of that there are people of different cultures, and people who are Hispanic look so different. We're every color of the rainbow, we're every height. So, every hair color, every eye color. So I try to be mindful of that as well. I just kind of throw in there do you speak Spanish? Do you want to continue this conversation in Spanish, just so that we're both understanding each other and feel most comfortable communicating what we're trying to say? So the message isn't lost and everything is clearer. But yeah, I did do that once without asking. I felt really uncomfortable. It just felt not like me. So for the most part, I asked.
Oh, great. Thank you. And thank you for speaking to that. I think it's the assumption piece that is so huge. Even though we are really trying to just engage folks, and that's wonderful. But we don't want to miss the opportunity or lose the opportunity. So thank you for that. Sha, hi. Please unmute.
Hi. I was gonna say, so I work at a school and we've recently gotten a lot of Spanish speakers. And one thing I learned was not to make assumptions on the Spanish aspect of it, because we were told like, hey, make sure you provide Spanish flyers and stuff like that for events. So we would hand out flyers and I would hand them out and I would hand some to people and they're like, I don't speak Spanish or I don't read Spanish. So they would give it back to me and ask for the English one. And so I learned to kind of instead provide both options on one sheet and have both Spanish and English on one flyer so that I don't mistake or assume anyone's language. And so that was just something that, it was a clear bias on my part that I learned that I had to kind of change up when we got a lot of Spanish speakers into the school.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's just, I think it's a wonderful reflection of trying to engage someone, but when you make an assumption, you can actually offend someone. So thank you for that. Nate, hi.
Hey there. One thing that was just like coming to mind for me too is just like in recognizing that like when folks are making assumptions, like ultimately at all costs, let's try not to make assumptions about our fellow humans. And also like the fact of the matter is like it's very real. I mean, we make assumptions all day, every day. Like we don't always have all the information that we need to be able to approach a situation the way we want to. So like really what I've noticed, like where like I'm just curious, like additional wisdom on is like different ways of acknowledging that. So like if assumption is made and you do realize like, oh, though this did make someone uncomfortable. And like my standard approach is like, okay, let's name that and call that out. Like, hey, I just realized I did this thing and it may have not landed or resonated the way that I intended. And like just like normalizing that like assumptions, yes, at all costs, and we don't want to make assumptions. And also it's human to make assumptions. That's there's there's a lot of reasons for that. And also I'm just sorry, I'm gonna start rambling. Just curious thoughts on like, okay, like yes, we don't want to make assumptions, and the times that we do accidentally, what are some ways we can like tactfully navigate that?
So I think that's great because it really speaks to our own awareness. I think when Esther was talking about how she felt so rude, she was very much aware. It's when we make assumptions and we don't pay it no mind and we keep going and we're not aware that we just did, that we acted on information that we didn't elicit. We just went with what we think we know and we keep it moving. That awareness piece is really important for us because we work with so many different individuals and there's so much diversity. And we're only speaking about the Hispanic Latino community here. So, and there's so much diversity in there by so many different ways, gender, age, the regional issues. I mean, we can name a whole bunch of it. So how is it? So I think there's an easy way for that, but I like the question that Nate posed. So what if we do make an assumption? We kind of make a mistake. How do we come back from that? What do you do? I'll tell you what, I'll give you time to think about that when we get on a break. Okay? We're going to take a 20-minute break. We're going to come back with the question. Just want to let you know that sometimes when we make assumptions, they could be really, really impacting. Because, like, for instance, when you go to the airport and your bags don't come out with the same bags as all the other passengers, and you tell the person in clear English, My bags did not come out of carousel 4 the way it was supposed to. I'm looking for my bags. They get on the phone and they come back and they say, your bags are coming, your bags are coming on carousel 4, Quattro, and puts her hands up. Nothing offensive about that. So it's really easy to push people away. So, but if we do make assumptions, there's a way we can come back from that. So when we get back from our 20-minute break, we're going to come back and start our discussion with that. And I want to delve into the Latino specific stuff so we can walk away with some of that information. So it's 11:59. Clyde, we're coming back in 20 minutes. So at 20 minutes after the hour, I'm not going to say 19, 20 minutes after the hour, we're starting no matter who's here and who's not. Thanks. Thank you everyone for participating. I want to apologize. I said we would take a 20-minute break, 2 hours into it, kind of breaking through the halfway point. And just to say, it's not a justification, but I am so conditioned to starting these trainings at 10. So I automatically went to 12 for breaking, and we should have done it at 11:30. So thank you for bearing with me. So the question was posed, how do we come back from making an assumption, like when we make that error? Let me see, I got it. Anybody want to speak to it? There's some folks here who did say, acknowledge and apologize. Very similar to what I just did. You know, I can own it. That's, I know in my humanness, I made a mistake with the timing, but what if we make an assumption about someone, which is, so something more personal, you know, acknowledging that you did and showing your own humanness can probably be a really great way to connect with someone else and letting them know that you're just, you know, that you are just as human as they are, you know. So we can acknowledge, make mistake, apologize, move forward without dwelling on it. Just do different. That's a good learning opportunity, I think, for all of us. So it does develop the self-awareness. So chances are that if you are in that situation again, what happened the last time you made an assumption or an error in someone's identity or how they approached them, that will likely kick up. And you can use that to channel how you approach the next person. So that's an opportunity. I think we get better because we're not perfect. I think because we have experience, and that experience builds on like what doesn't work also, so we know what does work with different people. So you're not perfect, but you have the biggest array of expertise and support opportunities for the individuals that you help. So if someone sees that from you, if they can feel like they're being seen, heard, and you're being and that you're not making assumptions from them, or if you did that, you take it back and you say, you realize, you acknowledge that brief shortcoming, the chances are you can develop a rapport that can come, that you can work from. So I think that's really great. You can always come back. It's when these, I think when we do overt racialized terminology and approaches, we shouldn't be doing it in the first place. That says a lot about where we're at. So chances are that you're not connecting with a lot of other people. But I doubt that. I don't think there's anybody here. But those are the things when we have situations where something comes up, that's when our awareness arises, and we want to work off of that. Those are opportunities for improvement. And as professionals, we want to continue to develop ourselves. So it's okay to, it's not okay to do it intentionally, but if it does happen, it's okay to come back from it. So I like that it was framed that way from Nate. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into some of the content. It's it's some concept and some content very specific to Latino culture, and then we'll come into some examples, and we'll try to take this home. Any comments, any questions, anything that's standing out that's kind of coming up for you in your head right now? I like that, Nicholas. Thank you for sharing that. That's very cool. Thanks very much for that. Okay, let me go to my slides. So I just want to start with a couple of things that are familiar to you, but that how we can use it going forward. So most of us, even in high school and we've seen this iceberg, this cultural iceberg, and the behavior iceberg is labeled as here, but it's had different names over time. And one of the wonderful things about this particular example is the idea that there are certain things that you see and certain things you don't see that are relevant for any individual as we connect this to perhaps a person and who they are. And so there are some things that may be obvious. The observable behaviors or commentaries or things we think we see, we could probably all agree that it's prompted by conditions, circumstances, learned ideas, philosophies, so a variety of different things. So whatever you do see, it's always motivated by something else. So it's important for us to understand what it's motivated, what we think we see is motivated by. So let me just speak to it just one more time. I said, from miscommunication often stems from misalignment of explicit and implicit meaning between the sender and the receiver. And let's just consider the environment that we're in today. We're talking about an environment that is not very friendly to a lot of to certain communities and cultures, and particularly the Hispanic Latinos, and especially when it's associated, like say, with migrants or immigration. And so because of the mess that's going on with that and the systems that are in place or not in place. And so many times that is translated to the overall population. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's not a lot of information. And so what is out there can very much influence our bias. And so implicit bias is a big part of this, and that's a whole other training. But it kind of speaks to what we believe we see or don't see. There are certain particular characteristics of a particular culture that is observable. But even with that, I would suggest not only is there something, is there an emotion or some values or some learned behavior that is driving what we think we see, but I also want to make a case make a point about what we do think we see. Very often what we see, we interpret through our own belief system, our own values, our own experience, what we believe we know. And so what we see may be defined a certain way for us in our minds. If we do not seek to ask for information, to elicit information very specifically about whatever it is that we see or we hear, then we will be left to what we believe, and that is based on our own bias, on our own judgment. And so we're not only are we not working with the person-centered aspect, but we are actually working with what we have a provider-driven situation there. And this is supposed to be a whole tailored aspect. We don't necessarily understand or look to understand or hear what are the perspectives of the individual to help explain what we think we see. Because we have our own value system, we have our own belief system. And so culture and recovery, the background, cultural background and of diverse representations include the values and traditions and belief systems of a person, and it can change. Mitigating factors, mitigating circumstances can help redevelop or rechannel those energies or those perspectives in different ways, but they are really key in us to being able to tap into some of that to help reframe and support a person's pathway to recovery. So services should be culturally grounded and sensitive and congruent and informed and responsive to the individual's unique needs and their perspectives. And so one of the things we always strive, and that's what the stigma-free slide earlier was about, the words matter slide, recovery-oriented language is part of the process. And we're going to support folks. We need to use terminology that is understandable. If we can do it in the same language, that's great. If we're using English, that's fine. But being able not to use being able to use stigma-free references in the language and how it's tailored to the situation for that person, that's a key factor in communicating and reaching out and connecting with them. And language and culture are both intertwined. When you interact with the language, you're interacting with a person's culture. We don't always interpret it that way, but this is something that I want to suggest that the research literature seems to always speak to, is that when you're speaking to someone, If I'm saying certain things with a particular definition, but I'm only saying the words, and the other person is interpreting, understanding the words that I'm saying, but they have their own definition. Think about the high context and low context cultures and those perspectives that come with that type of communication and that interaction. And so we're not necessarily speaking the same way, the same thing. So that's important to know. So let's do the research. Let me speak to you about just a few things that that the research for the last couple of decades have spoken to when it comes to identifying certain characteristics and patterns between the Latinx and Latina communities. And so there's a lot of variations between these different communities, and the experiences of the actual experiences of a person, you know, or a group will also further inform the perspectives and how they move forward, or how they interact or interact within their environment going forward. So we can see that if immigration is part of their past, we see a lot of issues with that, you know, and one of the things we've noted more in the recent years, and as far as the science has been dictating through research, is that with folks who are coming through immigration, you know, think about, we don't always think, we just think about the folks coming into the country. And I'm not saying us, I'm not trying to say that in absolute terms, but I say oftentimes that's what it's thought about. Somebody who comes into the country. Not a lot of people are putting too much mind as to what it took for them to make a decision to leave, what the environment was over there, what was it that pushed them out, what is it that's pulling them into this country, and the arduous journey process that they had to go to get here. And a lot of the experiences and trauma and stress related to that has an impact on how they will interact in a new environment here. It's not too dissimilar for folks with the Hispanic and Latino communities from different generations who have tried to build the quality of life here and have had challenges with disparities, have challenges with not accessing resources. And so those experiences may very well impact how they interact with you. So the socioeconomic status, education status, that just makes me think about the social determinants of health and how environmentally it can affect communities, families, individuals. And so one of the things about people and especially the older generation, but and this was identified, these values were identified in an article a while ago about how important it is for individuals to be successful. Successful is not always defined as having a lot of money and having these vacation homes and having a lot of cars. Successful can be as simple as being able to provide for your family and making sure the family is safe and protected. And so even doing that is a certain amount of perception within the Hispanic community for many people, that they perceive that as a prideful thing, as a really good thing, and they can be highly regarded because of that. That personalism aspect, or what we say in Spanish, personalismo, speaks to that part. It's also, personalism also has to do with how you engage someone. And sometimes in the older generations, we do see that there's a natural tendency to, and I think Forrest and the group and his team were talking about, you know, how we have these salutations, Mr. and Mrs., and how we grew up like that as, you know, and over time, how we tend to be conditioned to addressing people of authority or older folks that way. Well, you know what can be helpful as if we do, it's understanding that that's kind of part of the personalism too, as the respectful approach with someone. So that can translate in different ways. Personalism is also a thing about being able to be, is how we approach someone. So that approachability on your part is part of personalism. The fact that someone can feel comfortable and safe enough to start to speak to you because you hear them, you're able to communicate, you're able to ask them questions and let them speak, you're able to include some of the information that they're sharing in the process of you supporting them and to meet their needs. That's all part of what personalism brings to us as opportunities. Sometimes in indirect ways, these factors can impact language as well. So let's think about social interaction and interpersonal skills. Talked about simpatia, which is really a sense of congeniality, of kind of like working in a nice tone, not trying to acknowledge harshness or create any kind of like any kind of vibe that would create discord within an interaction or a conversation. So that's especially important. Now, so what I'm going to mention here, they all tend to exist for some folks at different levels to different degrees, depending on the conversation or the situation. So personalism is valued. It's the idea of like when a high context culture is looking to interact with someone in a more approachable, more personable way. And the culture may not be might be low culture and might be more limiting in terms of, how you dialogue, engaging from like a familiar approach is not necessarily what some folks do. That can be very helpful when you want to build a rapport and engage members of the Hispanic and Latinx community. So respect does include that the way to like certain salutations like Mr. and Mrs. And that's and I think about how that is so prevalent in the Hispanic and Latinx community. I also think what a difference it could be when we are working with young adults and youth and how we might be able to do that. And even bypassing all of that to even say, let me ask the person themselves, how would they like to be addressed? I like to say my name and I like to ask the person, how would you like to be addressed? And that's something that we can start to kind of incorporate. Sometimes the respectful thing has to do with the addresses, like putting a don before the name. Usually that's for or doña. That's kind of very, that's almost endearing, but it's very formal and within the Hispanic community. I would ask if that's okay or how they would like to be addressed. I don't want to assume that anyone that I can just put a particular phrase in front of their name and that it'll be okay. I don't want to jump to that. If I can get in the habit of doing that with every person, chances are I am respecting their autonomy. Chances are that I will be able to get exactly how they want me to connect with them. And that's a good point of rapport. So first impressions. So we can introduce ourselves in a respectful manner. And so respectful, you can give your hand if you want. Not everybody shakes hands, especially after the pandemic. I'm not so sure how many people want to shake hands, but it's really about a warm approach. It's about that approachability part. So that respect kind of intertwines with that personalism. When we approach ourselves and we mention, so my name is Diana and my pronouns are she, her, and ella. How would you like me to address you? And so I just gave an example of how someone can respond back to me. One of the things that I take advantage of, because I speak Spanish, is my pronouns are she and her, but I put ella there because I also want to show cultural inclusivity. And so that can take that to another level. So that can be helpful. But if I start first, and I do it with a smile most times, and then the other person can come back and tell me how they would like to be addressed. And so I don't want to make assumptions just because I have their file. And at this point, they have already done the intake and this other paperwork with and in another part of our programs. I want to be able to ask the person, how should I work with you? How should I address you? Confidentiality is another way of building rapport and building safety. And so many of our folks, and I'm going to say about cultural groups and definitely about Hispanic Latino culture, a lot of individuals in this culture do not necessarily understand or are aware that trauma and stress has been a big part of their life. And for folks who kind of struggle with the day-to-day, trying to keep food on the table, the roof over the family's head, and probably and may have had that as part of maybe why substances were used in the first place. For a lot of folks like that, with these types of situations, explaining confidentiality to help them know that they're in a space where if their information, whatever they share, stays there, unless they give permission to share with someone else. And then ask them, so what do you think you understand? What do you think about what I just shared with you? Is there any questions? Do you want to repeat it back to me in case in case you're not sure about some part of it? I think when people are understandable, are aware that some things that they say will stay right there, that can help to incite that trusting atmosphere. And then we always want to ask them, even if you got that file, we want to ask, so in their own words, what's their perspective? How did they see the situation or the need they want to meet? And so some of the very specific values that we see, and this is what some of the research has spoken to, is in a collectivist society, particularly like the Hispanic Latino a person, familism and some of this has been incorporated into Western culture. Family, we know the family is more than just what we call nuclear family. Family is not just mom and dad. That's just siblings and children. It can be the extended family. It can be whoever we believe has always been part of us, who we address and mention as family. So we've moved away, come a long way actually, from the static perspective of family from a nuclear perspective. That's more paperwork, that's more very static, very specific. When we're thinking about people, and particularly with the Hispanic community, we're thinking about a large group, it could be a large network of supports that is considered family. That godparent or that friend of the family who has always been around since your kids were young, before they went to college, before they became adults and with families of their own, that person is family a lot of times. And so the interesting thing about the family is that often when in a Latinx family is that the values and the norms or whatever traditions that particular family engages in, the philosophies that are taught, that tends to be part of the person's identity, but it's also the fact that the system is a support system. And so the family support system can be, it's also part of who the person is many times. And so we, from a low culture, an individualistic perspective from Western culture, the individual person can be all that they can be. You look at some of these ads, some of these older ads for coming into the military, in the Marines, be all that you can be, only a chosen few, or only for a chosen few. It really looks at an individualistic perspective of the person. And so in this community, we think about how the person exists and is who they are because there's a family there, because of all the other persons they've grown up and they've gotten to know from and learned from. And so it's very central to their identity. So it becomes a very important part of their family. When you're a male, say a cisgender male growing up in the Hispanic community, some of the attributes that are part of the role expectation is being head of the family. So you're the head of the family, you're the protector of the family. It is your responsibility to provide for the family. You are the man of the house. That is it's more than just a literal sense of the terminology. It's much more in the responsibility. And so in terms of, this is part of who you become or expected to become. And I'll say expected because that's very specific to what happens in the Hispanic Latino communities. In other cultures too, there's certain expectations as you're growing up. With the males in the Hispanic communities, that's all speaking to machismo. And now that's a term that even Western culture has adapted for a long time. So machismo, because it's speaking to the head of the family. And so it's very male dominated in the Hispanic community, especially with language. And so it can influence, say, a young individual's mind in terms of how they grow up. What can happen sometimes is, what if somebody does not meet their role expectations as they were taught, as they grow? And how is it that their own individual challenges with their environment or their world, however that's defined, how that has played a part in their substance use, where they now have a substance use disorder and they go programs. So you want to elicit and understand that this could have been part of the challenges for this individual. And so there is this, I'm going to read this quick because I really want to get into some of this content and ask you folks some questions. So without and with a cultural lens. So this is a true story about a friend of mine. She's a public defender in the Bronx in New York City. And so she had this case she shared with me, and she gave me permission to use in these trainings. So just consider for a second a young Latino male that was being arraigned for drug possession charges and was meeting the public defender for the first time in court. The PD, the public defender, is aware that his family, his wife, his sister, and his mother are all present there giving him support. So she met him several times in the courtroom, and she thought that was really good that they were there for that he had that support. He had violated his parole. And so the final appearance for the sentencing was for sentencing purposes. So after meeting with this young man for many times, when the day that they had to go before the court to get a sentence, get the sanction, the final appearance, the family was not present. And she was a little taken aback. She didn't understand if they were so consistent before, why they weren't there. And so when she asked him about where they were, he told her, see, he forbade them. He stopped them from coming to the actual hearing, to the sentencing, because they knew he was going to go away, but hearing it from the judge could be too much of a shock, even though they knew it was coming, and he was likely to get some time. And even though they knew that, actually going through the experience would have been too much that for them to have to go through. He didn't think it was necessary. He asked them not to come. So he wanted to spare them. So here's something that I want to say. Let me come out of here. So some of the things that I talked about in terms of like values that we see, characteristics and trends that we see in the Hispanic Latino community, like with some folks who are very male dominant and those who do adhere to these values, not everybody adheres to the same degree, the same combination. But what can happen is what you saw there, it's actually an individual that was protecting the family. Some more details include that this individual was using drugs, but he was selling drugs. He was selling drugs, and he was actually using a lot of money to keep the bills paid. The kids always had clean clothes. The house that they lived in was very clean. All the bills were paid. There was always food on the table. He provided for them. Now, one of the things about him and the community, because the mother was had an illness. I can't remember what it was. She had an illness and she was being taken care of. And they had his wife, he had 2 children, I believe. And the interesting thing is that the community themselves, they don't, normally do not look at drug dealing as a good thing. What they respected and appreciated and what they got support in is the fact that he was able to take care of his family. He kept the food on the table. He kept their needs met. And so this young man, even though we often may think about a case like this, like, hey, obviously you broke the law and you have to do your time. And instead of just looking at it from then, if you look at it from a cultural lens, you can see there were certain things of value that that was important to this person that they were trying to do, despite the fact that they didn't have a degree, they didn't have a job that that pays well. This individual was using the money that he was making to support the family. So he was providing, he was being the man in the house. He was the one that was trying to protect them in different ways. We want to be understanding that we need to have a broad lens or broad scope of a lens when we understand that some of these values can be expressed in ways a little bit differently than what we might expect. And so, yeah, if he wasn't given the alternative to incarceration opportunity, but if he had been, they may have been able to tap into the very values that he liked, taking the strengths from the fact he wanted to support the family. That's the very reason why we can help somebody get into potentially, maybe some employable programs that maybe also have school, so eventually makes has a well-paying job so he can still provide for the family and so on. So we can actually use some of the strengths from the values that the person adheres to, reframe it within the context of how we can support that person for recovery, wellness, and being able to go back into the community to be productive and to be supportive of his family. And so values are not always expressed. Values tend to be expressed throughout all different cultures, but they're not always expressed very specifically according to what we think. And so sometimes we have to list that information. We have to really unpack that information from how we ask the questions for the individual. So I'll give you another example. So there are other lenses, other female role expectations. So Marianism within females who in the Hispanic and Latino communities. So Marianism, so all of these are intersecting, as you can tell. So for women in a lot of Hispanic Latino cultures and traditions, there's a role expectation there too. And so we see Marianism is kind of like the very veneration of Virgin Mary in the Catholic religion. And it's one of the prominent theological belief systems within the Hispanic communities. And so it speaks to self-sacrificing and not being the head of the household, being submissive, whatever the man says, letting that being a partner to that person, but they don't have the last word. And so Marianism is self-sacrificing in many different ways, because there are things that that a woman in the community may be more likely to be doing and for the sake of the family. And so Hembrism is kind of speaks more specifically about who's the head of the household. So the man may be the head of the family, but she's the head of the household. That also means that she is the one that has that keeps the food on the table, keeps the food cooked on the table, makes sure those kids go to school. If they're sick, she takes them to the doctor. Our homework is done. The house is clean. The food is bought. She might even have a part-time or full-time job. So Hembrism really speaks to all these multiple roles. And it's interesting. In the United States, the American culture has a sweet 16, kind of like the coming out of the ladyhood, for a young woman. And Mexican communities, and then Puerto Rico and some other places, quinceañera, which speaks to the age of 15, is that rite of passage. Except when you have that rite of passage at 15, you might or might not get the party, but you will be. You often are assigned all these other role expectations. Because now you're old enough to have these multiple roles within the household also. And so, again, it's not absolute, but I will say that a lot of families do practice that. And so familism still is kind of like the focal point. Familism, you always want to be part of you support one another very closely. In a collectivist society, it's very interesting, Carl. What happens to one person has a really huge effect to everyone else. And so many times what we've heard traditionally over time is that what happens in the family stays in the family. And that happens with a lot of different cultures. And it's very, very specific also to the Hispanic Latino culture, and how some families keep their business inside. So sometimes if we don't have someone who's forthcoming initially, well, in time, as we develop a rapport, that can certainly come out. The person can start to feel safe and comfortable with you. And so when you see all these things intersecting, I'll give you another example. So another true story. So this is a Hispanic mother allows her daughter to use in the house. So if I'm a mom and I allow my daughter to use in the house, what's the first thought that most people might think? Anybody want to say? I'm allowing that person, my daughter, to use in the house. What does that mean to a lot of people? Go ahead, Forrest.
My first question is why? Why are you letting her use in the house? What's the reason why you're letting her use?
That's a good first question. Quite a few other people would say I'm enabling. Right? Okay, so let me come back. All right, let me give you some more details to that story. The mother allows the daughter to use in the house. The daughter has a low-paying full-time job, but she sniffs several bags of heroin, at least back in the day when it was real dope, a day. So sometimes she'll ask her mother for $10 to get to work, and that's just kind of like just to make sure that she doesn't get sick. And then one day she was getting her drug, and the police had a raid, and they picked up everybody who was in that dealer's vicinity. So she got arrested. So the judge offered her an alternative incarceration opportunity. So she starts to do well, and she was medically detoxified. She didn't go through the methadone or buprenorphine programs and none of that. And so she started to follow her program, and she was actually adhering to it. So her counselor thought that her mother really enabled her, and asked permission if he can talk to her mother. And so he can advise her how she can stop doing that, so better support recovery. So here's I'm going to tell you what happened. The other details is, so if what she's doing is, the other details was that the mother didn't want her to stop using drugs. And not like the mother used drugs, and not but the mother didn't want her to get picked up. The mother didn't want her to get jumped. The mother didn't want her to get hurt. The girl could not stop using. So the mother just figures, well, if you're going to use, at least use in my house, and just stay in the room. I don't want to see it. And so that was pretty much part of the agreement. She was trying to protect her child. There's a thing about protecting your family member. And that's what she was doing as a mom, especially a mom in a Hispanic Latino family. And so she didn't know that much about what addiction is about. And so the daughter did try to get clean on her own, but when you try to get clean off of heroin with your body, with those withdrawals, that's not a pretty sight. That's not an easy thing to do. And so she never thought that it would be safe for her to do it, medically. I don't think she had enough information at the time. And so this was a colleague of mine who told me about this case. And so what ended up happening was when she came out, she started to learn more about how the disease model of addiction got caught up in substance use in the first place and different issues. And what the counselor did was when he brought the mother in, then he learned that she was trying to help her daughter, not enable her daughter. And so instead of jumping to assumptions or conclusions without asking, it can look a certain way. If this was a criminal justice situation, it could have been looked like, oh no, the mother's enabling, she's a risk factor. We cannot have them together. Let's put her inside, a residential program. Which is certainly more than that, but still, that's often the perspective. From a cultural perspective, I'm going to share the slides again. From a cultural lens, the mother is very much into trying to protect her daughter. She has hopes and she has dreams, and she is a religious person and really feels that the more she prays, that eventually her daughter will get clean, that she won't need to have to rely on those drugs and she could stay safe. And so when all this happened, it was actually almost like divine intervention, because what ended up happening is the mother started to learn about how substance use works on the mind and in a person's life, and she was able to start to support her daughter from a recovery perspective. She didn't have the information. So the counselor also learned, because my colleague had told me how he had his aha moments, that he didn't realize that, in the Hispanic culture, what they were trying to do is protect. We automatically assume that we're enabling or we're doing something willfully. And sometimes what we're really doing is something else. If we ask questions, we can uncover that. And we can actually tap into that desire to want to protect and want to support, and use that as a protective factor for the client. The client herself, what was nice about that, what ended up being nice about that is that she had never tried to do the formal detoxification because of what she heard. She didn't trust it. But once it had to happen and she got detox and she was getting with the program and changing, it was actually a relief to her to be off the heroin. And she was actually feeling hopeful. So sometimes what we think we see, it needs some more information. If we think about the iceberg, this is one way to think about it. Think about the iceberg and the behavior that we see. We might see this person as enabling the daughter, and what's going on underneath that is really important. Is she enabling, or what's the reason for her to do it? And because the conversation I had told the counselor that as many times as she pleaded with her daughter would do it, but she didn't know anything about the physical dependence on heroin and about withdrawals, and that wasn't part of the knowledge base that she had. So this ended up being a good process. So if we can understand that sometimes things that we think we see, no matter how many times we see it, sometimes there are reasons or perspectives or justifications for it that we can unpack, and we can use some strengths from those perceptions to be able to support the folks in recovery or in substance use treatment or their mental health. And so we see some of the cultural values and belief systems being reflected in different ways. When it comes to Latinos and the Latinx community, one of the things that has always been part of the community is the spirituality aspect. The established theological perspectives that are really prominent within these communities are the Roman Catholic, the Pentecostal, evangelical. Those are the more established theologies. But there are different spiritual systems. And depending on what group you're talking about, in the Mexican American, there's such a thing as curanderismo. And curanderismo is kind of like a shaman, like a healer within the community. It doesn't have an established spiritual theology, belief system, but it is a person that can use different types of homemade remedies, and different types of activities that they can engage with different community members to help them get through different situations, different medical issues. And so curanderismo is very centric to the Mexican American community. Espiritismo, very similar, but that's very centric to the Puerto Rican community. Santeria to the Cuban community. These are still spiritual belief systems that some folks go by. And so that might be something to consider. There was a time where, let me tell you, there was a time when in our program, and this is a while ago, and so we had a small group of Spanish-speaking only community members, mostly older adults. And one of the things that happened with one of the individuals, they were getting, we're just leaving the fall and we're going into the new year. And by the beginning, first week, I think it was in February, some of the members of that group were going to graduate from the treatment program. So one of the individuals, I mean, they were coming all the time, and every once in a while they play their dominoes, and they're in between the different support groups, and they were done in Spanish, and they were adhering and following through with everything on their program, in their treatment class. So there was this one man who, this older gentleman who got pulled over his coat. They kind of pulled his coat a little bit because the counselor said, you know, they did the random drug testing, and his urine showed up, you know, positive for alcohol. And you can't graduate, you can't have any of that. What happens in treatment programs is you're not abiding by, you know, there goes graduation, and you will likely have to stay in the program longer. But the man was so adamant about saying he did not drink. He was swearing up and down, and he was like, because he was really proud of the fact that he has a sobriety time. And so he really wanted to graduate, and he was trying to tell the class, I never drank, I never drank, I never drank. And so, so one of the other counselors had helped this one individual, said, why don't you ask him what he ate today, what he drank today? So it was interesting because the conversation and went actually started to identify certain things. So he had, it was around winter time, older gentleman, more folks are more prone to colds and flus and so on. And so in terms of his habits, the counselor asked him, so tell me what your habits been in the last few days. And so, and he would say, you know, you'll get up in the morning, he was coughing a little bit. So he would get up in the morning coughing. His wife would give him his medicine. And then he would go to the groups. And then he'd go to his little part-time job in the afternoon. And then dinner. And then there was TV. And that ended up being like most of the 3 days. And he kind of generalized it that way. And so what the other counselor was suggesting to the first counselor said, ask him specifically what he's ingesting. So then he was very specific. He said he started his day at a certain time. He would shower and change. He would go up to breakfast. His wife would make him breakfast. She would give him this medicine. And so there was this one remedy that was in the family for a long time. It had a lot of honey because it included a lot of castor oil and cod liver oil, all those wonderful, tasty things that are supposed to be expectorants. You know, they're supposed to be kind of keep you from getting a cold or getting rid of a cold. And so, and then at one point, so the counselor says, what else is in it? And then as he goes through the ingredients, he also mentioned rum 151. And so he used to get big spoonfuls of like this honey type thick medicine. And then he would go through the rest of his day. And then he backed them up a little bit and says, so you're actually drinking 151. You're drinking alcohol. He goes, no, I'm not. I'm drinking medicine. So see, the perspective is very different from what the counselor's picking up. So here's the interesting thing. One spoonful is not going to do anything. It's not usually enough to like show up on any kind of drug test. But what happened is that after a couple of times, his cough wasn't letting up. And so he would take 2 and 3 and 4 or 5 sips of that particular medicine to keep his cough down. He did that for a couple of days, and that was when the drug testing came up, and it seemed to have showed up positive. The man did not drink alcohol to have a drink, to get high, to violate the rules, and regulations of the treatment program, any of that. He was having more medicine. That perspective cannot be known if the counselor didn't go out of his way to unpack that, to ask, to elicit the information from the individual. And how you do it is, you want to set up a safe atmosphere so someone's comfortable enough to share this information with you. But if he didn't ask those questions, we may not have been able to get to the heart of it. And so from there, because a lot of times, a lot of treatment programs, what we used to do is make sure, give them a list of clients, a list of do's and don'ts. Like you can't have, back at that time, you could not have Formula 44. We used to have alcohol back in it. You can't have certain substances or certain ingredients, certain things that can have alcohol or something, and put that in your system. We don't want to, have a response to, to wanting to pick up the drink. So what happened was they gave him a couple of weeks probation, and they saw that if he stayed away from that particular medicine, that home remedy. See, the home remedy is just that. It's not an alcohol drink to socialize with. And so when that was unpacked, what they did, they gave him 2 weeks probation, and they said, if you stay, if you keep going, doing the random drug testing and you come up clean, then you can graduate. And he ended up graduating with the rest of his group. What we learned, what the organization learned, was to take a step back and revisit the types of questions that we ask on intake to get more specific information about the communities we're working with, to understand what are some of their cultural traditions and habits. What are some of the things that might impact their ability to succeed in the program? And so culture can look so many different ways from different people. So from the perspective of the client, he was telling the truth the whole time. He did not drink. He was having medicine. And so it was a very, very different conversation when it was starting to pack. It provided a lot of insight. And so when I'm giving you these case studies or these scenarios, these are all true stories, because sometimes what happens is what we think we see is actually not necessarily what we think we interpret. And so these spiritual belief systems sometimes include some of those types of remedies too. And so it's important to understand, what is it that, what's important to the person, but also what are certain things, their ideas about spirituality, what do they practice, and to keep that in mind. And so many people do combine the respect for mainstream medicine tradition and traditional healing with strong religious components. What I will say is science, the treatment, and mental health disciplines have incorporated the use of curanderos, who have been specifically trained to be to help mitigate between the communities, specific different Hispanic and Latino communities, specifically with the healthcare system, the substance use treatment system, and mental health system, because that has helped to kind of bridge, the resources with, and also, kind of use the cultural approach to help bring folks together to needed resources. And so we've taken advantage of that. We don't always do that, but I think we've had a lot of opportunities. We've learned a lot. And so when you think about the spiritual perspectives and other nuances of the culture, what we think we see can be expressed for a variety of reasons, and we need to ask questions. So there's a couple other things that the research shows about fatalism. Sometimes some folks who are religious, who have a religious perspective, it'll be what God wills it to be sometimes. And some folks might think of that deflecting responsibility. It's not that. It's really their belief system. So it's a way, I think it's an opportunity for us to kind of engage that belief system within a conversation to support recovery or health and wellness. Medical beliefs or work or reliance on manual labor and the acceptance of pain related to it. A lot of folks will not give up their job unless they absolutely cannot move. And there are some folks who have a high regard for being hardworking, and that's part of who they are. And it's part of that personalism aspect of the communities, but they could also be very untrusting. There's a lot of history continues to repeat itself. There is so much that many people are very leery of and very mindful and very high stressed about in terms of what areas they're living in, whether ICE is coming, whether they can share information about themselves, because you might end up finding out that even though they're legal, their family may not be illegally here, or you may start to make a judgment if you know that family members, are doing certain things and you're not, so there's a whole bunch of information that they may not be forthcoming unless you start to build that rapport and ask questions and try to see and hear that person. And so immigrations, there's always have their own challenges, whether, the family dislocation, I think that's a really big thing. Dislocating from, keeping a distance from what you have always known has been a part of you, and you have to go to a new place. And that is not just a journey, it's when you arrive. That we haven't been this country hasn't been very kind to people who have arrived from other countries. And I'm not talking just about Mexico, but, and so having to deal with that on a daily basis, the high stress can certainly be a risk factor for the substance use. And so all of these can be, all of these can play a part. And I think all of this kind of makes the case for why we should go forward, seeking to be curious, as was mentioned, and to be able to elicit information to help you support better that person. There are also levels of acculturation with different generations already here in this country. The stress that comes with acculturation is a real thing. And stress, not not only impacts mentally, but impacts physically, and medical issues can occur and so on. It's very hard for folks to deal with certain things. Acculturation can be a real big thing for some folks, and it's something that we should be mindful of and ask questions about. And so when someone is struggling with addiction or substance use, the words used can be so impactful. And so stigma and shame are typically uniform biases. And you know what's interesting about this is that a lot of folks in the community, unless they're working in the field, like I see a lot of folks here who seem to be, who probably are part of the cultural group that we're speaking to today. And there's a lot of folks who are not aware about the science, or the health perspective of substance use or alcohol use disorder or opioid use disorder, because we're using a public health perspective these days, but whereas folks are actually, for a variety of reasons, are kind of finding themselves at a level of disorder where they meet the criteria of a disorder, and a lot of challenges in their worlds are just amplifying. And so the stigma and shame associated with that can be part of the reason why some folks are not as expressive or as participatory with you. And so when we think about effective communication, start by stopping. And I love this, it doesn't matter how busy I am in my world. I know I probably have a couple of crises I have to work from. Maybe there's 2 clients whose appointments got pushed back. I still have all that documentation I have to do. I still have to take a breather, stop, take a breath, and understand that I'm about to meet someone who I don't know yet. I've seen their file. They seem to have some issues that I've seen before, but I still don't know this person. That's the healthiest way to think about it, instead of saying, oh, I worked with this before, this is gonna be easy. I don't want to make any assumptions. I will put myself to work harder if I do that. And so let's just set aside assumptions. One of the things we could do, and Coaching Humility does a lot about this, is like helps us to look inside who we are first. And so that way we're less likely to let that be part of the lens we see someone else with. So let's just question that. There are remove physical barriers to listening. It's kind of hard for someone to, let's just say this. Like, for instance, if you're in a counseling session and you're in a room, an interview room, and I call it that because that's what we used to call it in one of my past jobs, and I'm behind this big old desk and I have this really great comfortable chair, and that person is in a very simple chair and the seat is lower, and we're both at the same floor, the same level of the floor, but it looks like I'm looking down at them and they have to look up at me. I mean, that's just one example of how physical barriers to listening can happen, because somebody may not be too responsive to me behind that. So I want to make the place safe and comfortable, and something that is more aligned with maybe their culture. And so we know that we have certain, maybe some cultural, artifacts that we can have in our room, the lighting, the placement of the chair, the door, whether it's open or not, asking that individual whether that door should be closed or open. I would think that would be a very important good start. Show that person that you're listening. And I like this about the MI interviewing skills, is that that we not only listen to what is being said, we listen to what is not being said, we listen to what is being said with what tone. And also we can start to pick up on some of these challenges that this person may be having. And so that can help inform what kind of questions we also ask. So be patient with someone. So the culture of humility process. So this is one of the best ways, best ways to take this, that is a concept, to put it into practice. So culture of humility inside I believe somebody mentioned it in the chat earlier. It's a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique. It's the idea that if I'm going to be in the people helping field, as one of my past professors had told me, that is, if you're going to be in the field where you're going to help people, you have to take a step back every once in a while. You have to check yourself. You have to see where you're at, because after a while you kind of get, she said, desensitized. So that was before culture of humility was like known or existed, I believe. And so she has said, so one of the things that she says resonates with me is that we can take a step back. Every once in a while, it doesn't have to be when we're absolutely exhausted, because I know you folks work hard. You have so many things on a daily basis you have to achieve, and usually a lot more things kind of show up. But every once in a while, you have to take a step back and kind of look at, are you working with different people? Are you in the way of that? Or are you at least acknowledging who you are, how you are, And when you consciously and intentionally do that, you're more aware, and that awareness helps you in not allowing your own perspective to help define what you think the person is saying to you, or what you think you see. And so it's more about being other person oriented and cultural humility. And there's a few definitions from a lot of different places, but this was tagged back in 1998, I believe. And so it's more focused on what the person tells you, and you ask questions. Those open-ended questions you mentioned earlier, those are very, very valuable to invite somebody into a conversation, to invite someone to give you more than just a yes or no answer. You get more information and insight as to who the person is. How better to create a treatment or service plan that is conducive and tailored to that person. When you start to understand that certain things that you think they will probably need, it depends on what their world looks like and the realities of their capacity. And so cultural humility requires historical awareness. Know who you're working with, know where your folks come from. We know with the Hispanic Latino community, there has been a lot of hardship in the history of this community. We understand why there's a different way of looking at Columbus Day. It's more like Indigenous Day. And I would say from Puerto Rico, when the Taino Indians were almost annihilated, and all the Caribbean islands, and part of the reason why this is a culture that is made up of the richness of so many other beautiful cultures, is that there a lot of times part of the history is not just the richness and the beauty and the flavors and colors that they bring, but it's also the historical underpinnings, the historical events that have happened to them. And for many people, we don't always ask them, but we're not always aware that many families and many members are very well aware of what's happened to their culture over time. Right now, you can ask a lot of folks how they feel about what happened to when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. And that's just one example, because Puerto Rico is just, the Puerto Rican community is actually the smaller part of the overall Hispanic community. And they're still helping each other to get to rise above the impact of the damage that was done. And so when you have experiences where it continues to exist, that if you don't do it for yourself, that you can't expect too much from outside worlds, that impacts your stress, your own trauma issues. It impacts your ability to provide. It impacts your wellness, your attitudes on how you engage other people. So it's something to be mindful of. And so different groups have different things. When I said Happy Hispanic Heritage Month, it started September 15th because President Johnson back in '68 recognized that, that was the date that in the 16th, there were dates that in the Mexican communities had really spoken to I think they fought in from their freedom there was a war that a battle that they had, and they won their freedom from Spain, I believe it was. And there are certain things that are very important to the community. There's a lot of pride there for different reasons. We can tap into that. So the historical awareness can be really, really helpful to make it more tangible and more logistical. So you understand what I'm saying. Think about how certain non-federal holidays might be very important to the members that you're providing services to, and why you shouldn't make an appointment on that day. You wouldn't know unless you ask that person, because if that person doesn't show for an appointment for a date that you put down, and we don't know that there is say a day of celebration that day, that's a big deal for some folks. So Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, it's recognized in this country. You know what? Sometimes folks still put appointments for that day, and for some folks, they have certain practices. Dia de los Muertos, which is like what we translate as All Saints Day, and huge. I know folks who actually go through all the rituals and the practices and the celebration of folks that have transitioned on, and so that's really important to know that and support that. A lot of research has been consistent in the fact that tapping into your culture, it's a way to support wellness and recovery. And so that's an opportunity. So community-based care and process, the cultural humility practice, in practice really, it's really about understanding, that you have your own way of looking at things and not necessarily the same as someone else. Own what yours, and then understand, be other person oriented. In other words, elicit information from them, work from where they're at, and be comfortable with not knowing everything about everyone. Because you should really be working off of what you elicit, what you ask them about, and not what you have experienced for many years now with the same community. And so every person is an individual, and we can be very responsive when we ask questions and learn from them. So yeah, you mentioned the ORs, so that's here. And then we want to ask information, like, you know, getting to know somebody new. So you want to find out what's important to them. You want to understand how they perceive their situation. So like engage them, invite them into the process. Most of the times, the successful outcomes has a lot to do with how well we engage someone so they can participate and support their own process. And so if we can do that, that would be great. So, okay, so I spoke quite a bit here. So if you wanted to be more informed about the Hispanic and Latino cultures, what are some things that you might want to do? How can you enhance your knowledge about Hispanic and Latino cultures? What's some activities you might want to engage in? Oh, you can't. So if you wanted to know more about, and I'm not saying the client, I'm saying about the community, so you could be better informed. What are some things you might do? Attend community events, cultural festivals. Yeah, do your own research, yes. Watch a novela. I might not do that. Engage in cultural holidays without culturally appropriating it. Okay, connect with community groups. Yeah, genuine curiosity. You can ask the person, just know that no one person, like I identify as Latino, but I'm not speaking to all my people. I'm not doing that. I'm speaking to what the research is showing and what we've seen in practice. Very, very different. And so, yeah, speak to community leaders. You know, so we have Hispanic Heritage Month right now. What opportunity does that present for you with your Latino clients? Does it present anything?
Diana, can you repeat the question, please?
We have the Hispanic Heritage Month going on right now. How can that help us engage with the clients? How can we know how that might or might not be important to them, other than just asking, you know, like asking them?
Attend the community events that they are organizing and putting to the majority, in my experience, a lot of people, when we have the Hispanic Heritage Month celebrations, the majority of people that attend are Latinos. And so the invitation, extending the invitation to really people that can understand, learn, educate about the culture. And so but there's plenty of events during this time.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what I'm speaking to. So there are different events that are celebrated within those 30 days between September 15th and October 15th. And you have a Hispanic person or you have a Latina person, and they identify in a specific way. Learn from them and says, how do you folks celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month? You know, and how would you do that? We already know there's Puerto Rican Day Parade, there's Dominican Parade, the Dominican Day Parade. There's a bunch of different and festivals. We know during the holidays there's such a thing as parrandas. There are variations of parrandas in New York during the holidays. Parrandas is something we should all be mindful of. And not only Puerto Ricans do engage in that, a lot of other Hispanics do too. And that's when traditionally it's like when people get together and they go to one house and they have music, they have their instruments, and they get fed, sometimes they have their drinks, and then they go to the next one. It becomes kind of like a convoy, more people add on. And this used to be something that would happen over several days and during the holiday season, during the Christmas season. I started to see some of that here being replicated in New York when I was doing direct services. And so I wanted to know who was engaging, because I didn't want folks to be at risk if they're around people who are drinking. So we had to work around, okay, how do you keep yourself safe? Do you make meetings? Do you call your support group and do all kinds of things? That's how those types of traditional norms kind of are the traditions or the festivals or the holidays involved with the culture, how that became something I needed to find out about. And so think about the different experiences that you can have. Sometimes there are some celebrations of different kinds that is made, that you're made aware of. Forrest said something about having a cultural day. There are a lot of organizations that for the different cultural groups, they will have a day where they celebrate the foods or that culture of that day, and people bring in their foods. What a nice opportunity to communicate with different people and learn about someone's background and get insight. And so you can ask your clients, but you can also be informed about what happens in the community. Sometimes you have certain members of the communities. You have the healers in the communities. You have different people that you can go to. Sometimes faith-based communities are really a good place to go to, where the Latinos and Hispanic people might go to. That might be a place that you want to collaborate with and learn a little more about the traditional norms. So there's so many things we can do to expose ourselves. The biggest benefit of doing that is that we don't get surprised, we get more familiar with some of the possible activities, and we are more informed on how we engage an individual. You don't have to know everything about anybody else or any other culture, but it doesn't come as a shock when you see certain things. That lady who was protecting her daughter, even though she was using, like, how dare she? Well, you know what? Instead of that, it's like, oh, I understand. She's trying to protect. She probably doesn't have that information. A lot of, what we usually call ignorance is really just a lack of information. It's more about somebody's really trying to do something to help their daughter because they're at a loss for other options. We can provide that options if we ask, and we don't jump to conclusions. So I think that can be really helpful in terms of us being comfortable with folks we don't really know. Some recommendations include take time to understand backgrounds and preferences. And I know managed care made our jobs almost impossible, but because we also need to be trauma informed, and culture and trauma kind of comes hand in hand. We want to make time and space to be able to listen and hear and who the person is and where they come from so we can better support them. And so there's certain preferences that many people have for their identity. Let's elicit what that is and move forward with that. So respect really is not just being rude. It's not that. Respect is really working with what the person is telling you because you're asking. And so you incorporate those perspectives to support them in their process. So, and here are some more last minute comments. So I want to end with this: culturally responsive recovery. We are so used to having certain programs or certain services that we automatically provide to almost everybody who comes in, no matter what they look like or who they are and what their issues are. Let me say it like that. So let's not fit the Latino client into the existing program services and put them here, and there. Let's see what we have available and then facilitate a recovery-oriented plan that takes whatever is from what is available and make it culturally responsive to what is important and what the needs of that individual. Everybody doesn't have to fit into the same box and look the same way. Make it fit to their very, very specific issues. And this is about being linguistically appropriate. And language and communication, you're learning about not just the culture, but you're also learning about the idioms and how they understand things. And the resources that you're going to provide need to be responsive to that. If the ultimate goal is for the person to succeed, we want to build a plan around how we can help them succeed. That's true partnering with an individual. Questions, comments? Nobody wants to hang out a little bit more? All right. Let me show you this. When you get the slides, all right? So these links will be live. Building health equity and inclusion. There are so many resources that all of the ATTCs put together in here, and some of mine are in there too. I'm telling you, there's so much information, and it can be so helpful, and we're going to go forward and create more. So that's a good, valuable resource for you. And I just want to thank you all for your time. Thank you all for your patience when I kind of messed up with the break. And here is the code to scan and fill out your evaluations. And my colleague, I bet he already put it. Yep, he put it in the chat box. Click on the link. It takes more than about 90 seconds to submit. When you do that, it'll help justify us sending you that certificate. Not only that, we will send you a copy of these slides. There's a lot of cited sources here in case you're interested in getting more information. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have an amazing weekend. It's supposed to be nice on the East Coast.